A wind tore across the Arizona flats like a living thing. A lone rider pushed hard against it, 4 hours from home, satchel slamming against her hip. Something was wrong with the horizon. Smoke, thin at first, then thicker, blacker. The storage shed was already half swallowed in flame. Sparks climbed toward the cabin roof, where a woman lay coughing, burning with fever. Rockets, water, heat so fierce it blistered skin on contact. A beam cracked overhead. A hand yanked her back a full step as the timber crashed down where she had stood. For in the scorched dirt beside the ruin stood a fresh wooden stake, red cloth fluttering, for numbers burned deep into the wood. Property line surveyed, Rock 1000, for 882. The line was wrong. It cut straight through the only spring. Someone had already decided who the water belonged to. He stood there, hands blistered, staring at the stake. The fire still refused to die. Arizona Territory, 1882. The wind came down off the ridge before the sun did. It found every crack in the cabin walls, every gap between the logs, for it rattled the tin patch on the roof like something trying to get in, for, and Ayanna had stopped believing, for a long time it was only wind. For inside, the fire was down to embers. The cabin held one room, and everything in it had been made to do more than one job. The table doubled as a workbench when there was mending to be done. The trunk in the corner doubled as a bench when company came, which wasn't often. A row of dried herbs hung from a nail near the hearth, or willow bark and sage, and things Ayanna couldn't have named herself, tied there by her grandfather's hands years back, and kept up ever since, because throwing them out would have felt like throwing out a piece of him along with them. The floor was packed earth, swept so often it had gone hard and smooth as stone in the well-worn paths between bed and hearth and door. It wasn't much of a home by the standards of people who had more, but it was theirs, for every log of it. Ayanna had never once, not on the coldest night, wished herself into a finer one. Elena lay under 2 blankets that used to be 3 before the third one got sold to a trader outside Wilcox for coffee and flour. It was shaking. Not from cold. Ayanna had felt her mother's forehead an hour ago, and it had burned like the flat of a stove left on too long, the kind of heat that doesn't come from weather. "Drink," Ayanna said, tipping a tin cup toward her mother's mouth. For Elena's lips barely moved. "I don't need water. I need a cough," took the rest of the sentence. Long. Wet. It bent her whole body forward like something was trying to fold her in half and wouldn't stop until the job was finished. Ayanna held her shoulders until it passed. Because that was the job now. Holding. Waiting. Counting the seconds between one cough and the next, the way you'd count seconds between lightning and thunder, trying to measure how close the storm really was. She'd gotten good at the counting. She hated how good she'd gotten at it. "You need rest," Ayanna said. "I need to be at that ranch by noon." There it was. Spring. Neither of them had said out loud since sunrise. Finally sitting in the room between them like a third person, nobody wanted to look at directly. 3 days ago a man named Otis Pratt had ridden out from town with a paper nailed to a post and a smile that didn't belong anywhere near his eyes. He'd worn a fine coat for a man delivering bad news to a sick widow, Ayanna remembered thinking. He hadn't gotten down off his horse the whole time he talked. The paper said the land was owed. Brand was Elena's father's land, granted to him on his discharge papers years back. Pratt said the bank didn't care whose name was on a grant if the taxes weren't paid, and the taxes hadn't been paid, because there hadn't been money, because there hadn't been steady work, because a fever had eaten 2 months of washing and mending Elena might otherwise have done. France, because it never stopped. It was the truth of it. One reason led straight into the next like a chain, link after link, and at the end of the chain was a family with no roof and a man in a fine coat, pretending the chain wasn't his to answer for. For Ayanna had been the one standing in the yard when Pratt rode up. For Eleanor had already taken to bed by then, the fever just starting to climb, and so it had fallen to Ayanna to stand in the cold with her arms crossed and watch a stranger hammer a notice into their own front post, like he had every right in the world to be doing it. Nothing personal in this, Pratt had said, not quite meeting her eyes. A hammer swinging easy in his hand like the work of it didn't cost him anything at all. Frank's bank. Taxes are taxes. I don't make the rules, I just carry the paper. My grandfather earned this land, I don't doubt it. He'd finished the last nail, stepped back to admire his own work like a man hanging a picture straight. It doesn't change what's owed, though, does it? Land doesn't care who earned it, only cares who's paid for it lately. 4. There's a housekeeper position at the Callaway Ranch. She'd said, more to herself than to him, thinking out loud in the particular reckless way fear sometimes makes a person do. But my mother's put in for it. Pratt had looked at her then, really looked, the way a man looks at a horse he's deciding whether to bid on. That's so. He'd swung back up into his saddle, unhurried, gathered the reins. Well, I'd get her there quick if I were you. 3 days isn't a long stretch of time in my experience. Goes faster than folks expect. He hadn't sounded sorry saying it. Rounded. Anything. Faintly pleased. For the way a man sounds when a plan he hasn't spoken aloud is falling into place exactly the way he'd hoped it would, one small cruelty at a time. 4. Ayanna had stood in the yard a long while after his horse had disappeared over the rise, staring at the notice nailed crooked into the post, before she'd finally gone back inside to lie to her mother about who'd come calling. Except there was one door still open. 4. The Callaway Ranch, 4 hours' ride south, was hiring a housekeeper. Word had gone round town that the pay was fair and the position steady, and Elena, who had scrubbed floors and washed linens for half the ranches in the territory and never once been late, but never once complained, never once let a family down that trusted her with their linens or their children had put in for it weeks ago. The foreman had sent word back, "Come at noon. Bring your papers. There are others asking too." 4. Taji had held that land since before Ayanna was born, granted to him on paper the army had signed and sealed the year, the fighting finally quieted enough for men like him to be given something instead of only asked for things. 4. He'd built the cabin himself, grog by Prummer, after the grant came through. Brani used to say half joking, though Ayanna had never been sure how much of the joke was real, that a man who has to fight for a piece of ground twice, once with a rifle and once with a hammer, learns to love it in a way that comes easier to men who only ever had to buy theirs. He'd raised Elena on that land, Elena had raised Ayanna on it, 3 generations of one family, and a bank clerk 2 counties away who had never once set foot on it, now held the power to erase all 3 of them from it with a single signature, on the strength of taxes that had gone unpaid, for reasons that had nothing to do with the land's worth and everything to do with a world that made it very hard for people like them to hold on to money once they'd earned it. Tried to sit up. She didn't make it past her elbows before her arms gave out and she dropped back onto the pillow, breathing like she'd run a mile instead of moved 6 inches. "Ma, I can do it," Elena whispered. Her eyes were glassy, fixed on some point past the ceiling. "Just give me an hour. The fever breaks in the morning sometimes. It's broken before. It hadn't broken. Not once in 3 days. Ayanna had watched it climb instead, a little higher each night, the way water climbs a riverbank, before it finally goes over. For Ayanna looked at her mother's hand, wrapped around the tin cup, was shaking so hard the water inside made small circles. Over and over, like something trying to find its way out of a bowl and not finding the edge. She thought about lying, telling her mother the fever looked better, telling her they had time. She didn't. "You can't ride today," Ayanna said. Quiet. Steady. 4. The way you'd talk to a spooked horse, not because her mother was fragile, but because the truth needed a soft hand to land right. "You can't sit a saddle for 4 hours in this wind. You'd fall before you cleared the first ridge, and then we'd have 2 problems instead of 1. 4, then we lose it." No, Elena's eyes found her daughter's face. "I'll go," Ayanna said. For a moment nothing moved, not the fire, not the wind outside. It did, but Ayanna didn't hear it, because her whole body had gone tight as a drawn bowstring, waiting to see what her mother would say. Elena said, sharper than a woman with a fever had any right to sound. "Absolutely not. Why?" "Because you're—" Elena stopped herself. 4. Ayanna watched her mother choose the next word carefully, the way you'd pick your footing crossing a river on stones you didn't fully trust. "Because it's not safe for you out there, not with things the way they are." 4. Not with the soldiers still riding patrols, and every rancher jumping at his own shadow, seeing raiders in every shape that moves wrong at dusk. "I know how to ride. That's not what I said." "I know what you said." Ayanna stood up. 4. She walked to the small trunk in the corner. 4. The one that held everything they owned that mattered and knelt in front of it. France started pulling things out before her mother could argue further. 4. Because if she stopped moving, Bree was going to start thinking. 4. And if she started thinking, she was going to lose her nerve. And she could not afford, morning of all mornings, to lose her nerve. Fra Iona, I'm going. They ask for me, not you. They'll take one look. And what? Iona turned, one hand still in the trunk. Turn me away? Fine. Then we've lost nothing we didn't already have this morning. If I don't go, we lose it for certain. And we already know how that story ends. Otis Pratt already told us. Raina didn't answer, because there was no answer, they both knew it. Wrath was simple, and it was cruel, and there was no way around it. Somebody had to be standing in that ranch house by noon with papers in hand. Or the position went to the next woman in line. And the next woman in line probably didn't have a foreclosure notice waiting for her at home like a wolf sitting patient by the door. Fratiana pulled out a leather satchel, worns soft at the corners, the leather gone the colour of old saddle oil. It had belonged to her grandfather. She held it for a moment longer than she needed to, just a moment. Long enough to remember the smell of him tobacco wet, the dust of 100 trails, long enough to hear, somewhere behind her eyes, voice saying the thing he always said when she was small and scared of something she couldn't name. Fear rides with everyone, Iona. The question is who's holding the reins. She opened the satchel and checked what was inside. Elena's letters, a list of names, ranchers, townsfolk, people who'd vouch for her mother's work if anyone bothered to ask them. 4. And tucked in the bottom, where it had sat for 3 years without anyone touching it, an old photograph in a tin frame. She almost left it. Then she didn't. She slid it into the satchel without knowing exactly why. The way you sometimes carry a thing not because you need it, because leaving it behind feels like leaving a piece of yourself in an empty room, Iana. Her mother's voice had dropped, not angry now, just afraid, the particular flat afraid, of a person who has run out of other tools to use. Please, I have to. You don't know that man, Calloway. You don't know what kind of... I know we have 3 days left on this land, and this is the only door I can see standing open. Iana crossed the room and knelt by the bed. She took her mother's burning hand in both of hers. I'll be careful. I'll be back before dark. Promise me. I promise. It wasn't a lie. Not exactly. She meant to be careful. She meant to be back. A promise made at dawn. With the whole day still unlived in front of you, really just a hope wearing a promise's clothes. Fran's small, cold part of Iana already knew that, even as the word left her mouth. Thought, briefly, of the winter, 3 years back, when the roles had run the other way, Iana laid up with a broken wrist from a fall off a green colt she'd had no business trying to break alone. Fra and Elena working double the hours to cover for it, coming home each night with her hands cracked raw from lye soap, and never once complaining where Iana could hear it. For her mother had a way of carrying weight so quietly, you sometimes forgot she was carrying it at all, right up until the day it finally showed on her face, and you realized how long she must have been holding it. That was the debt Iana meant to repay this morning. If repay was even the right word for a thing you owed your own blood. Not a debt. Exactly, just a turn. Everybody's turn came around eventually, if the family held together long enough for it to. She stood. She found a scrap of paper and a stub of charcoal, and she wrote a short note in careful letters. Gone to check the traps. Back by supper. And set it by her mother's water cup, because the truth would only make Elena try to rise from that bed, and rising was the one thing she absolutely could not do. Her grandfather's boots still sat by the door, exactly where he'd left them 3 years back, worn through at both heels and never once moved since. For Eleanor wouldn't part with them, and Iana had stopped asking why, because she understood it better than she could have explained it to anyone else. Some things stayed in a house, not because they served a purpose anymore, but because moving them felt like agreeing the person who wore them was truly, finally gone, France, and neither of them was ready to sign that particular agreement. For Iana touched the toe of one boot with her own, briefly on her way past, then she dressed, not for herself, for the door she was about to walk through. She had one good dress, dark blue, the hem let down twice already to keep pace with her height. And she put it on with hands that weren't quite steady, braided her hair back tight, for the way her mother did it, for church visits into town. The visits where people looked at them a certain way, for a look Ayanna had learned to name only much later, for Elena had taught her, for without ever saying it out loud, for that you met that look by standing straighter, smaller. You never gave a stranger the satisfaction of watching you shrink. She pulled on her boots, scrubbed the dust off with a rag until the leather held something like a shine. Present yourself with dignity. For her grandfather's voice again, for unbidden, arriving the way memory does sideways, for uninvited, for exactly when you need it most and never a moment before. For dignity is the one thing they can't take unless you hand it to them yourself. She wasn't going to hand it to anyone. Outside, the sky had gone the colour of a bruise healing, pale at the edges, dark low along the mountains. For their horse, for an aging bay mare named Copper, stood in the lean-to with her head low, for unbothered by the wind, because she'd long since stopped being bothered by anything the territory had left to throw at her. For Ayanna saddled her with hands that moved on memory, not thought. Fringe bit stirrup, motion a small anchor, for holding her steady against the thing rising in her chest that felt, if she let it, for like it might swallow her whole before she'd even cleared the yard. Swung up. She looked back once, for at the cabin, for at the thin grey thread of smoke still climbing from the chimney, for at the door, behind which her mother lay burning with fever and trying, even now, find the strength to rise and stop her. For then she turned the mare south and rode. The land between the cabin and the Calloway ranch was not kind, and it did not pretend to be. It was scrub and rock and long flat stretches where the wind had nothing to slow it down. It simply ran, unbothered, the way it had run for 10,000 years before there were bank notices or men named Otis Pratt riding out with papers to nail to posts. Ayanna rode into it. The first hour her mind stayed on her mother, the sound of that cough, for the heat coming off her skin like a stove left burning too long. She counted the miles the way she'd counted the seconds between coughs, a way of holding the fear at arm's length, giving it a job to do besides eating her alive from the inside out. For by the second hour the land itself started talking to her the way it always did when she rode alone long enough for her mind to go quiet. Rare, that stand of mesquite, twisted low and stubborn against the wind. Her grandfather had shown her that kind of tree when she was young enough to still be carried on a horse in front of him, instead of riding one herself, her small hands gripping the pommel while his voice rumbled somewhere above her head. "See how it bends but doesn't break," he'd said. "That's not weakness, Ayanna. That's the smartest tree out here. A stiff tree snaps in the first real wind. A bending one is still standing come spring." There the dry wash cutting east, for where he'd taught her to read water that wasn't visible anymore, just the memory of water written into the shape of the land. Like a sentence, you had to know the language to read at all. Look for where the grass grows a shade greener than it should, he'd told her. Water doesn't disappear, girl. It just goes quiet. He'd been gone 3 years now. For long enough that some mornings she woke up and had to remember, for all over again, for that he wasn't in the next room, for that the particular creak of his boots on the porch boards wasn't coming. For not long enough that the reminding didn't still hurt, fresh as a burn each time. He had never talked much about the years before she was born. For the years when the whole territory had been at war with itself, white and Apache both drawing lines in blood across land neither of them had made, and both of them claimed as their own. Hawkins, instead about small things. Mostly the kind of stories that made a child laugh, without understanding they were being handed the softened edge of something much harder. For a mule that hated soldiers on sight and would try to bite any blue coat that got near it, so that the whole company learned to keep their distance, and Taji alone could lead the animal anywhere he pleased. For a winter cold the coffee froze solid in the pot before a man could finish pouring it, and they'd had to chip it out with a bayonet and melt it over the fire like ice off a pond. He never talked about the men he'd saved, except once. She'd been maybe 15, sitting with him on the porch while he worked a piece of leather with a knife, for the light going gold and long across the yard, the way it does in the last hour before supper. And she'd asked him the way children ask things, straight through the middle of a subject, without knowing there was a wall there at all, whether he'd ever killed a man in the fighting. He'd been quiet a long time. long enough that she'd thought he hadn't heard her or was choosing not to answer, and she'd almost let it go. Then he'd said, "I pulled more men out of that fighting than I ever put into the ground, Ayanna. White men. Ours, or didn't much matter. Out there, once the shooting started and the smoke came down thick enough, you couldn't tell one uniform from another at 10 paces. A man bleeding out in the dirt is just a man bleeding out in the dirt. He doesn't stop being that just because somebody back home taught you to hate the colour of his coat." She'd asked if any of them ever thanked him. He'd laughed, short and without much humour in it, more breath than sound. Them never woke up long enough to know who'd carried them, and the ones who did, he'd stopped there, set the knife down on his knee, looked out at the darkening hills like he was watching something only he could see, something moving slow across the ridge that had nothing to do with cattle or weather. Some debts don't get paid, Ayanna. They just get carried, man to man, sometimes so long the men forget they're carrying anything at all. Sometimes so long they die still carrying it, and never once set it down. She hadn't understood it then. Not really. She'd been 15, and the words had washed over her, the way a lot of his words did in those years, felt rather than understood, filed away without a use for them yet. 4. There was another memory that rode with her now too, one she didn't reach for so much as it reached for her, the way certain memories do when the ground underfoot starts to feel like the ground that grew them. She'd been 12, in town with him for supplies, standing outside the mercantile while he settled an account inside, when 2 men had stopped near her on the boardwalk and started talking like she wasn't there at all, or worse, like she was there and it didn't matter, the way men talk about weather or livestock, something present but without a say in the conversation. One of them had said something about her grandfather's kind not being fit to carry a rifle for the army, only fit to carry water for men who did. The other had laughed. She'd stood there burning, not knowing where to put her hands, not knowing whether to speak or run or simply disappear into the wood grain of the boardwalk itself. Raji had come out mid-law, a sack of flour over one shoulder, and hadn't said a single word to either man. Simply set the flour down, and hurried, and looked at them the way he looked at weather, moving in over the ridge, not afraid of it, fighting it, reading it plain, taking its measure. For the laughing had stopped on its own, the way laughing does when the man it's aimed near stops giving it anything to feed on. Walking home, she'd asked him why he hadn't said anything back. Because they wanted a fight, he'd told her, and a fight is a gift you only give to people who've earned the trouble of receiving it. Those 2 hadn't earned a single word out of my mouth. Save your words for the ones worth spending them on, Ayanna. Everybody else, you let them talk themselves out into the open air, where the whole world can see exactly what they are, and you walk on. She rode now, 4 hours into the journey, with the sun climbing hard toward noon, thought she still didn't fully understand it, really. But she thought about it more than she used to. The photograph in the satchel. She hadn't looked at it in years, hadn't needed to, hadn't wanted to, because looking at it too long made her chest go tight in a way she didn't have time for on an ordinary day, let alone a day like this one. She didn't know why she'd brought it. Except that some part of her, some old quiet part that had nothing to do with reasoning and everything to do with instinct, same part that had told her which direction to turn at every fork in this trail without her having to think about it, had wanted her grandfather riding with her today. For even just his likeness folded flat in a bag on her hip, even that felt like enough to steady her hands when the wind gusted hard enough to make copper toss her head. Trail dropped into a rocky wash a little past the 2nd hour, dry now but scarred deep by whatever water had cut through it once, or boulders scattered loose across the bottom, like something had thrown them there in anger and never bothered to clean up after itself. Copper's hoof caught wrong on a loose stone halfway down the slope. The mare pitched, trembled, for one long, breathless second. Ayanna felt the whole animal go out from under her, the ground tilting wrong beneath the saddle, threw her weight back on instinct, pulled the reins short, and Copper found her feet again at the very last possible moment, snorting hard, her ears pinned flat with the fright of it. Ayanna sat there a moment, heart slamming, waiting for her own hands to stop shaking before she trusted them to hold the reins steady again, because that was all it would have taken. For one wrong step, one loose stone in the wrong place, a broken leg for the horse, or worse for the rider. For out here, where the nearest help was hours away in either direction, and her mother lying at home, believing her daughter had only gone to check the traps. She swung down and led Copper the rest of the way through the wash on foot, taking it slow, for testing each footing before she trusted her weight to it, and did not climb back into the saddle until the ground had gone solid and even beneath her boots again. Grandfather's voice again, quieter this time, less a memory than a kind of company. Slow is smooth, Ayana. Smooth is fast, for a man in a hurry is a man who trips. She mounted up, kept right, the sun climbed, the wind didn't quit. Stomach cramped somewhere past the second hour. And she realized she hadn't eaten since the evening before. And there was nothing to be done about that now, except keep riding and ignore it, the way she'd learned to ignore most things that couldn't be fixed by ignoring them. It was a strange kind of skill. Nobody teaches a person on purpose, but poverty teaches anyway. Patient and thorough, whether you wanted the lesson or not. What if she's worse by the time I'm back? What if the fever breaks the wrong way instead of the right one? Because fevers did that sometimes, didn't they? Broke wrong, broke into something worse than what came before it, and there was nobody out there to stop. She made herself stop the thought, the way she'd make herself stop a colt from bolting, short and firm, before it could gather any real speed. Thinking that way did nothing but burn daylight she didn't have to spare. Her mother was alive when she left. Her mother would be alive when she got back. She would not let her mind run any further down that road than that. Not today, not with 4 hours still ahead of her and 4 more behind. She thought too about the town. About the particular quality of certain looks she'd collected over the years, the way another girl might collect ribbons, the mercantile owner's wife, who always found a reason to check the till twice after Ayana had touched anything. Sunday congregation that made room for her, and Elena in the back pew, always the back pew, with a courtesy so careful it felt more like a fence than a welcome. She had learned to carry those looks the way she carried the satchel now, slung across her body, weight distributed so it wouldn't throw off her balance. You could not put a thing like that down. You could only learn to walk with it. She passed one other soul on the road, that whole morning, a rancher's wife driving a light wagon the opposite direction, a boy of 5 or 6 asleep against her shoulder under a blanket despite the hour. The woman had slowed as they passed each other, the way strangers do on an empty road, out of some old unspoken courtesy that has nothing to do with who either of them is, and had lifted a hand in greeting. Rough morning for riding, for the woman had called, unkindly, for a nodding at the wind. Rough morning for most things. Brianna had called back, and the woman had laughed, short and real, and driven on, without a second look at anything but the road ahead of her. For it wasn't much, it cost the woman nothing to say it. But Ayana found herself turning the small exchange over in her mind for the better part of a mile afterward, plain, for unremarkable ordinariness of it, stranger, who had looked at her and seen nothing more complicated than another rider caught out in bad wind. She wondered, the first time, how much of her life might have gone differently if every stranger managed that same small, unremarkable grace, and how strange it was that the ordinary kindness stood out sharper in her memory than half the cruelty ever had, simply for being rare. Around mid-morning the land began to change. Scrub gave way. Slowly, then all at once, fence, view wire, tight and running for miles in a straight line that had clearly cost somebody a great deal of money and an even greater deal of patience. The kind of fence a man builds when he intends to still be standing on this land in 20 years. Round the fence cattle, fat cattle, more cattle in one glance than Ayana had seen in her whole life put together, grazing on grass that had been given water on purpose, brought by accident of rain, dark green in patches where irrigation ditches ran unseen beneath the surface. She had heard about the Callaway spread, for everyone in the territory had heard about it, the size of it, for the wealth of it, for the way Wade Callaway's name got said in town with a particular weight, part respect and part something warier, for the way people speak about weather systems too large to argue with. But hearing about a thing and riding into the middle of it were two very different animals. and she felt something small and cold settle into her stomach as she took in the scale of it, the sheer, staggering size of a fortune built on land, not so different from the land she was about to lose, same red dirt, same stubborn sky, handled by hands that had never once had to worry whether the next season would be the one that broke them. She did the math without meaning to, the way poverty teaches a person to do math on everything, whether they want the answer or not. For what she could see from this stretch of fence alone, the cattle, the wire, the graded road, likely amounted to more money than her family had touched in 3 generations combined. For it wasn't envy exactly, the feeling that settled into her chest. It was closer to a kind of vertigo, the particular dizziness of standing at the bottom of something and trying to measure its full height by craning your neck back as far as it would go. 3 days, she thought. 3 days stood between her family and losing everything, and somewhere behind this fence line was a man who probably spent more on supper most nights than her mother made in a month of washing linens. Wind picked up hard in the last stretch before the gate, kicking loose dust into a thin brown haze that hung low over the road and stung at her eyes until they watered. Proper tossed her head against it, unhappy, and Ayana leaned forward and murmured something low and steady until the mare settled back into her stride. She thought, briefly and uselessly, of turning back, of telling herself she'd tried, that the wind and the distance had beaten her fair, that nobody could fault a person for failing against weather like this. She didn't turn back, she kept riding. Because there was no version of this day that didn't end with her walking through that door, whatever waited on the other side of it. For the main house came into view an hour before noon, and Ayana's first thought, unbidden, gone almost as soon as it arrived, was that it didn't look like a ranch house at all, for it looked like something that had wandered west out of a city and gotten comfortable staying. 3 stories, timber and stone, dark wood trim, a porch that wrapped clean around the whole front of the building like an arm around a shoulder. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys, not one. Men on horseback moved between outbuildings, shouting things she couldn't make out, driving cattle in and out of pens with the kind of ease that only comes from having done a thing 10,000 times before and never once had to wonder if there'd be enough grain left over for the horse by winter. She slowed Copper to a walk as she came through the iron gate and felt all at once very small. It wasn't the size of the house that did it. She'd known the house would be big, for word of it had travelled far enough that even out at their cabin, half a territory away, people spoke of the Calloway Lodge like a landmark, for it was the sheer number of eyes that turned toward her as she rode in cowhands pausing mid-motion, for a woman beating a rug over a porch rail stopping to stare, for a boy leading a horse toward the barn, slowing his step without seeming to notice he'd done it, and the particular quality of that staring, which was not curious exactly, and not quite hostile either, but something suspended between the two, waiting to see which way it would need to fall. She had felt that look before in town, at the mercantile, church, in the 2 or 3 years since the fighting had properly quieted, but the fear of it hadn't the look that took in her braid, cheekbones, particular cut of her jaw, and made a decision about her before she'd said a single word, before she'd had any chance at all to prove the decision wrong. She rode through it anyway, because riding through it was the only thing she had ever known how to do with a look like that. You could not argue a stranger out of their first impression, but you could only refuse to shrink under it and let time do whatever slow work it was going to do. One of the hands, for a young man leading a string of horses toward the corral, caught her eye as she passed and touched the brim of his hat, small and quick, like he wasn't entirely sure he was allowed to, but had decided to do it anyway before he could talk himself out of it. Ayana nodded back, small, quick, and neither of them said a word. She filed the gesture away regardless, parked it somewhere alongside the stairs, proof that not every eye in this yard had already made up its mind. The yard itself was busier than any she'd seen men hauling feed, a boy of no more than 10 chasing a loose chicken across the dirt with more enthusiasm than success, ring of a hammer on iron coming steady from somewhere near the smithy. Was, she thought, for a ranch than its own small town, higher and self-sufficient, kind of place that could weather almost anything the territory threw at it simply by virtue of its size. 3. Hitched Copper at the rail out front patted the mare's neck once, a small, private gesture, the last steady thing she'd touched for a while, she suspected, and climbed the porch steps toward the wide double doors. Her legs did not feel entirely like her own. She stood in front of those doors a moment longer than she meant to, long enough to feel the wind pull at the hem of her dress, one last cold reminder of the 4 hours behind her, or long enough to think of her mother's hand shaking around a tin cup, or of the note lying by the water, or of every version of this morning that could still, for in the next few minutes, part in her hands, for long enough to hear, somewhere in her chest, her grandfather's voice one more time, clear as if he stood at her shoulder. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Ayanna. It's deciding to open the door anyway. She opened the door. 4. The entry hall took her breath in a way she didn't expect and didn't like the way it made her feel, small and out of place, and didn't like that she'd let it show, for a second, on her face before she caught herself. Polished floors, a chandelier of iron and glass hanging from a ceiling high enough to hold its own weather. Smell of beeswax and good coffee and something sweeter underneath, cigar smoke maybe, the smell of money that has been sitting comfortably in a room for a long time and has never once had reason to hurry. 4. Behind a heavy desk at the centre of the hall sat a woman in stiff black-grey hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, a silver watch pinned at her collar like a badge of office. She was counting linens, making small marks in a ledger with a fountain pen, and she did not look up. A pair of maids passed through a side door carrying trays, and one of them glanced at Ayanna with open curiosity before a look from the woman at the desk sent her hurrying on without a word. Somewhere above a floorboard creaked under a step. Nobody could see. 4. The house had the particular stillness of a place where a great many people worked hard to keep it running smoothly, and where the smoothness itself was treated as something almost sacred, not to be disturbed by anything as ordinary as a stranger walking in off the road. Frau Ayanna crossed the floor. Her boots made a sound against the polished wood that seemed enormous in the quiet, each footstep announcing her before she was ready to be announced. She stopped at the desk. The woman finished her count, made her mark. Only then did she lift her eyes, and Ayanna watched the whole transaction happen on the woman's face in the space of about 2 seconds. The polite, distracted attention of someone expecting a normal caller, then the flicker of surprise. Then something else, something that closed like a shutter, dropped fast against weather. "Can I help you?" It wasn't really a question, it came out flat, a formality. Nothing more, the kind of phrase a person says when they've already decided the answer doesn't matter. "I'm here for the housekeeper position," Ayanna said. "My name is Ayanna." Halloran consulted a list at her elbow without much interest, running one finger down a short column of names. "I don't have an Ayanna on the noon list. You wouldn't. My mother's name is on it, Elena. She sent word 2 weeks ago, and she was told to be here by noon with her papers." The pen stopped moving. "Your mother?" "Yes, ma'am. And where is your mother?" "She's ill. Fever. Couldn't ride." Ayanna lifted the satchel slightly, an offering. "I have her letters, her references. For I can answer any questions you have about her work. She's cleaned houses and washed linens for half the ranchers in this territory and never once been. I'm sure she's a very capable woman." The pen set down, deliberate, final. "But I don't interview family members, girl. I interview the woman who'll be doing the work. That's how it's done here and how it's always been done. She'll be doing the work. I'm only here because she can't ride. Then she should have sent word she couldn't come." The woman's eyes moved over Ayanna, slowly stressing, and something in her face tightened as she finished the sentence in a tone Ayanna had heard too many times to mistake for anything but what it was. "Not sent you. There it was. Not you specifically. Not a girl. Not a stranger. You." "I don't understand," Ayanna said, though she understood completely. Fran's small, bad part of her wanted to make the woman say it plain, instead of letting it hide behind manners the way it always did. The woman's jaw worked once, like she was deciding whether the effort of pretending was still worth it. She decided it wasn't. "Mr. Calloway runs a careful household," she said. "We've had trouble in this territory. Real trouble. Families burned out. stock run off, men who won't sleep easy with their windows open even now. I won't have him coming home to find an Apache woman standing in his front hall with a bag in her hand, whatever her intentions might be. The word landed in the hall, the way a stone lands in still water, small, sharp, and the rings kept moving long after the stone itself had gone still. Ayana's whole body tightened, every muscle drawing in at once the way it does before a fall. Because there it was. Plain, at last, no manners left to hide behind. Not a question of whether her mother could scrub a floor, not a question of references or letters or years of honest work never once let go for cause. For a question of what she was, said out loud in a stranger's front hall like it, settled the matter before it had even begun, like the matter had never really been opened to begin with. From my grandfather, Ayana said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, of this territory. He carried wounded men off ground, soaked in blood, that wasn't his own white men, ranchers' sons, soldiers who never even knew his name, and not one of them ever asked what he was before they let him save their life. Nobody stops a man bleeding out to ask him what he thinks of the colour of the hand pressed against the wound. That's a fine story. It's not a story, it's the truth, and I can prove every word of it if you'll give me the chance. Run along, girl. 4. The woman's hand drifted toward a small brass bell on the corner of the desk. Before I have someone see you off the property. Walk away. Just walk away. There's no shame in it. You tried. You can tell Ma you tried, and she'll believe you, because it's true. 4. Except it isn't enough to have tried. Except trying doesn't keep a roof over anybody's head. Except no. She wasn't leaving. 4. Not like this. You haven't even opened the satchel. I don't need to open it. You don't need to. You've already decided. Ayana felt her voice, climbing and let it, because quiet had gotten her nowhere in this hall, and she was fast running out of quiet to spend. That's the whole trouble, isn't it? You decided the moment I walked through that door, and everything since has just been you finding polite ways to say the same thing over again. Halloran's mouth thinned to a hard line. You will lower your voice in this house. No. The word came out of Ayana before she'd decided to say it. It hung in the air, proud in the quiet hall. 4. And she watched 2 men near the front door stop what they were doing and turn to look. For one of them still holding a coil of rope he'd been carrying through on some other errand entirely, his head tilted like a man watching a storm decide which way it meant to break. A young woman near the stairs, a maid, judging by her apron, no older than Ayana herself, had gone very still with an armful of linens, her eyes flicking between Ayana and Halloran with an expression that wasn't quite disapproval, entirely, though she didn't dare let it show any plainer than that flicker. I beg your pardon. 4. The man with the rope had set it down entirely now, forgotten. 4. And a second man had drifted closer from the direction of the parlour, drawn by the rising voices, the way people are always drawn to the sound of a thing about to break. Nobody moved to intervene. Nobody moved to leave either. I said no. Ayana felt something rise up through her chest, hot and steady, the same feeling that had put her on a horse at dawn against her mother's wishes, and carried her 4 hours through open country to get here. I rode 4 hours to bring you my mother's papers. I'm not leaving this hall until somebody reads them. The woman's hand closed around the little brass bell. For 1 long second, nothing happened. The bell didn't ring. Halloran's fingers stayed curled around it, waiting. One last flicker of doubt holding her back from the final small motion that would end this. 4. And Ayana held her ground and waited to see which way that hesitation would break. 4. And a voice came down from the staircase behind them, deep and unhurried, the kind of voice that had clearly never once in its life had to raise itself to be heard. What in blazes is all the shouting about, Halloran? Every head in the hall turned, for a man stood on the landing of the wide staircase, one hand resting on the banister, the other holding a folded newspaper. He didn't seem in any hurry to finish reading. 4. He was somewhere north of 40, broad through the shoulders in a way that hadn't gone soft silver, starting to work its way through dark hair at the temples. His clothes were fine good wool, a coat, but worn with the particular ease of a man who'd spent most of his life in rougher clothes and hadn't quite forgotten how to stand in them. 4. The 2 men by the door set down whatever they'd been carrying without seeming to notice they'd done it. The maid on the stairs pressed herself flatter against the rail to let him pass, though he hadn't asked her to move, and likely hadn't even seen her do it. Was, Ayana thought, the particular quiet a room goes when everyone in it has learned, for over years of practice, for exactly how much weight one man's presence carries. Stopped questioning why. Her eyes moved over the hall once, landed on Ayana, stayed there. Mrs. Martha Halloran's spine straightened like she'd been caught at something. Mr. Calloway, my apologies. This young woman was just leaving, was she? It wasn't a question aimed at Halloran, aimed, somehow, at the whole room, the way a man might ask a horse whether it was really going to spook at nothing at all. Wade Calloway came down the stairs. He moved without hurry, the newspaper still folded under one arm, and Ayana watched him and made herself stand straight, made herself not shrink the way every instinct in her body wanted her to. Stopped a few feet away, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, and she did. "You rode out here alone," he said. Not unkind, just direct, the way a man asks a question when he actually wants the answer and not the performance of one. "Yes, sir." "Where from?" "North of the Solano Flats. 4 hours' ride. Near enough. That's a long way for a young woman to ride alone through this country, especially now." His eyes flicked briefly toward Halloran, and something passed between them that Ayana couldn't read. Some old current of understanding or disagreement, worn smooth by years of working together. "What brought you?" "I'm here for the housekeeper position. On behalf of my mother, Elena. She was to be here at noon, but she's taken sick. Bad fever. She couldn't sit a saddle if her life depended on it, and it very well might, so you sat one for her." "Yes, sir." Calloway was quiet a moment. Ayana felt the weight of that quiet more than she'd felt any of Halloran's sharp words, because there was something in it that felt like actual consideration, and she hadn't expected that, not after the hall, not after the word that had already been said in it. "France, Mr. Calloway, France," for Halloran started, "I really don't think, I didn't ask what you think, Martha." Calloway's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Not this time. I'm only trying to protect this household." "I know you are." Something in his tone softened, just slightly, an acknowledgement that didn't undo the correction underneath it. "Exactly what you're trying to do, and most days I'm grateful for it. This isn't one of those days. This young woman rode 4 hours through open country to bring me her mother's references. The least this house owes her is a proper hearing, and I intend to see she gets one." Halloran didn't argue further. But she didn't step back either, entirely, standing her ground a few feet off with her arms folded and her jaw set, posture of a woman who has lost a point, but not the argument behind it. He turned back to Ayana. "What's your name, Ayana, and your mother's work? Tell me about it. All of it, not the summary." Ayana felt something in her chest loosen just slightly, just enough to breathe around properly for the first time since she'd crossed the threshold. Lifted the satchel. "She's kept house for the merchant family outside Wilcox 4 years running. Before that, laundry and mending for half the mining camp at Turquoise Gulch, 2 winters straight through the worst cold anybody there could remember. She's never once been let go for poor work, only for outfits closing down or families moving on to better ground. I have her letters here, and a list of names who'll speak for her if you send word and give them the time to answer, and the fever." "How bad?" Ayana's voice caught, slightly, on the word. He hated that it did, hated that some part of the fear she'd been holding at arm's length all morning had finally found a crack to slip through. "She's burning up, coughing something fierce deep in the chest. I left before dawn, and I don't," she stopped herself. Started again, steadier, forcing the words level. "I need to be home by dark." Calloway studied her. It was not, Ayana thought, an unkind look, but it was a thorough one. The look of a man used to weighing cattle and land and men in equal measure, and rarely getting the weight wrong. And she made herself stand still under it, the way she'd stand still under any weather. Because there was nothing to be gained by flinching, and a great deal to be lost. "Come with me," he said finally. Halloran's mouth opened, closed again. "Sir," she tried once more, "the gentlemen from the rail company are expected within the hour. Ashford has them in the west parlour already, waiting on you personally. They'll keep." Silas, she caught herself. Mr. Calloway, I only mean to say I heard what you meant to say the first time, Martha. For Calloway's tone stayed even, but something in it had gone flat and final, a door closing without needing to slam. This won't take long. He turned and started down the hall without checking to see whether Ayanna followed. He simply expected that she would. She did. The hallway ran deep into the house, past a dining room set for a meal nobody was eating yet, past a parlour where she caught a glimpse of two men in fine suits standing near a cold fireplace, clearly waiting on someone. One of them checking a pocket watch, with the particular impatience of a man used to being kept waiting for nobody. For neither of them so much as glanced her way as she passed, too absorbed in whatever business had brought them out here, and for once Ayanna was glad of it. She had used up all the composure she meant to spend on strangers for one morning. For Calloway didn't slow, for didn't explain, for didn't acknowledge the men in the parlour at all, for though Ayanna thought she saw one of them start to rise before thinking better of it. For his study sat at the back of the house, through a set of heavy doors that shut out the noise of the hall the moment they closed behind them. Bookshelves climbed the walls floor to ceiling, packed tight with ledgers and land surveys, and a scattering of novels that looked considerably more read than the rest. A rifle hung above the cold fireplace, well kept, but clearly not fired in some time. Single-framed map of the territory took up most of one wall, dense with pencil marks and small notations that must have meant something once, boundary lines redrawn so many times over the years that the paper had gone soft and grey along every fold. For a wide desk sat in front of a window that looked out over pasture, running clean to the mountains, and the whole room smelled of leather and old paper, and something faintly like tobacco that had been smoked a long time ago, and never quite left the wood, worked so deep into the grain it had become part of the room's own smell, rather than anyone's habit. "Sit," Calloway said, dropping into the chair behind the desk. Ayanna sat. Feet didn't quite reach the floor, comfortably in the large chair across from him, and she planted them anyway, for, because there was nothing to be done about the size of the furniture in a rich man's house, and she wasn't about to let the chair itself get the better of her before the conversation had even started. He held out a hand, the letters. She passed the satchel across the desk. He opened it, or pulled out the folded papers, unfolded them with the unhurried care of a man who'd read 100 letters of reference in his life and knew exactly what he was looking for and exactly what didn't matter. His eyes moved down the page. Housekeeper for the merchant family, laundress at Turquoise Gulch, seamstress one winter for a freight company outside Bowie. There's a gap here, as he said, tapping the paper, 1878 into 80. No work listed. My grandfather was dying that year, Ayanna said. Consumption, slow and hard on him. Ma stopped taking in work to nurse him through it. Learned to make willow bark tea for the pain when there was nothing else to give him. Learned to lift him when his legs gave out, because a doctor cost more than we ever had, and the nearest one was 2 days' ride besides. Calloway's eyes came up from the page. She gave up wages, he said slowly, to care for a dying man. He wasn't just a man. He was her father. Something rose in Ayanna's voice, sharper than she meant it to be, and she let it stay there because it was true, and she wasn't going to soften it for anyone's comfort, least of all a stranger's. You don't leave family on the trail because the trail's gone hard on you. That's not how it's done, not in any household worth its name. Calloway didn't answer right away, set the letter down slow, and looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Ayanna felt the urge to fill the silence and made herself resist it, because filling silence was a habit of people who were afraid of what the quiet might reveal about them, and she wasn't going to give him that particular satisfaction. You said your mother's fever's bad, he said finally. Yes, sir. How long? 3 days. Getting worse each one, not better, no matter what I try. You have a doctor out that way? No, sir. Ayanna's jaw tightened. There's no doctor within 20 miles. We manage as best we can with what we've got. You manage, Calloway repeated, quiet. Strike. He was turning the phrase over in his hands, and finding something in it he didn't much like the weight of. He set the letters down and studied her a moment, the way he might study a piece of land he was deciding whether to put money into. Halloran give you trouble out there, he said. It wasn't quite a question, for Ayanna considered lying. decided against it the same as she had with Elena that morning. She was finding, over the course of one long day, that she had less patience left for softening the truth than she used to. "Yes, sir." "What kind?" "For the kind you'd expect, given what I am and what she's heard about this territory lately." Ayanna kept her chin level. "She wasn't wrong to be careful. There's been real trouble. I understands that better than most, living where I live." 4. But careful and cruel aren't the same thing, and she'd stopped telling them apart before I'd said 10 words. Something shifted behind Calloway's eyes, quick and unreadable. "Martha lost people, out past Antelope Wash, some years back. She doesn't talk about it, but the whole house knows, one way or another. It doesn't excuse what she said to you. I want to be plain about that. It just might explain some part of it. I've heard that kind of explaining before. Usually right after the cruelty, never before it." "Fair," Calloway said, and something almost like the beginning of respect moved across his face. "I won't ask you to forgive it on my account. That's not mine to ask for." He turned the conversation, not unkindly. "Your mother's not the only one who's worked hard, I'd guess. 4. What is it you do when you're not riding 4 hours to save a job for her, whatever needs doing? Try and fence. Break horses nobody else wants to try twice. Trade work with neighbours when there's a harvest or a roof that needs patching before the rains." Ayanna's mouth pulled, not quite a smile, more the ghost of one. "Poor people don't have one trade, sir. We have whatever trade the week requires." Truest thing anybody's said in this study in a month. Calloway said, and there was no flattery in it. Plain agreement. The kind a man gives when a thing lands square, and he sees no reason to pretend otherwise. "Father," he said, "careful in the way a man is careful walking onto ground. He isn't sure will hold his weight. Is he part of this household too? He died before I was old enough to remember him. Fever, same as most things seem to take around here, one way or another." Ayanna said it plainly, without the flinch some people expected of her when the subject came up. "It's been my grandfather, then my mother, and me since. That's the whole of our family, sir." All. "But it's held together longer than plenty of bigger ones I've seen come apart. Held together takes more work than most people credit it for." "Yes, sir, it does." He was quiet a moment, turning something over behind his eyes that Ayanna couldn't read, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone a shade softer than the businesslike tone he'd carried through the rest of the interview. "What is it you want, Ayanna?" "Not for your mother, for yourself. Once this is settled, one way or another." The question caught her off guard enough that she took a moment before answering. France. Nobody had asked her that in longer than she could easily remember, not what she needed, which people asked plenty, but what she wanted. As though the two were different questions with different answers, which she supposed they were. "Frand, land that's ours, free and clear," she said finally. "A winter where I don't have to do arithmetic every time I eat something, and to stop having to prove every single time I walk through a door that I'm not whatever the last person who walked out of it warned everyone I'd be." Calloway nodded slowly, like the answer had confirmed something he'd already begun to suspect about her. Clock on the mantel struck the half hour. And somewhere beyond the study doors, Ayanna thought she heard the faint sound of a carriage arriving, wheels on gravel, voices exchanging pleasantries, the railmen, likely the ones Halloran had been so anxious about. Calloway didn't so much as glance towards the sound. He looked back down at the satchel, and his hand went into it again, checking the bottom, the way a careful man checks any bag before handing it back, and Ayanna watched his fingers close around something that wasn't paper at all. Felt her stomach drop. The photograph. She'd forgotten it was still in there. Forgotten in the rush of the hall, in the weight of that word Halloran had used, in the fear sitting cold in her chest about her mother. She'd simply forgotten the tin-framed photograph was riding along with the letters, tucked at the bottom where it had sat untouched for 3 years, waiting for a hand that wasn't hers to find it. Calloway pulled it out into the light and went completely, utterly rigid, the newspaper still folded under his other arm, forgotten entirely. Ayanna watched something move across his face that she didn't have a name for, yet not quite recognition, not at first, more like the look of a man hearing a sound from very far away and trying to place it before it faded past reach. He turned the photograph toward the window, toward better light, and studied it the way he'd studied nothing else in the whole conversation, thumb moving once, twice, Along the cracked corner of the tintype was an old photograph, faded at the edges. A group of men in dust-worn uniforms stood in a loose row in front of what might have been a supply wagon, all of them young, all of them looking at the camera with the particular blankness of men who'd stood still too long in the sun, waiting for a photographer to finish his business and let them go back to whatever war was waiting for them the moment the plate was exposed. "Who is this?" Calloway said. His voice had changed, lower, rougher at the edges than it had been a moment before, like something underneath it had shifted loose. "My grandfather," Ayanna said. "There, on the left." For she pointed to the tall figure at the edge of the frame, for a young Apache man in a worn army issue coat, standing straight-backed, even in a faded photograph 17 years old, ground level, for eyes steady on the lens, in a way none of the other men in the picture quite managed. Calloway didn't answer. His eyes had moved. Away from the man Ayanna had pointed to, and toward another figure in the photograph, smaller, younger, a boy barely out of boyhood, standing near the center of the group, uniform coat hanging loose off narrow shoulders like it had been cut for a larger man and never properly taken in, eyes wide and unguarded in a way none of the older men's were. Ayanna watched Calloway lift his free hand, watched him touch, slowly, almost without seeming to know he was doing it, his own weathered cheek, and then, slowly, faded face of the boy in the photograph, one finger resting lightly on the cracked emulsion, as though he could feel the years through the glass. Something is wrong, she thought. Or not wrong exactly. Something is, she didn't have a word for it. Something had opened in the room, some door she hadn't known was there, and she was standing too close to it to see what was on the other side. He hadn't asked about her mother's fever in almost a full minute. He hadn't asked anything at all. The clock kept ticking on the mantel. Outside the window, a man's voice called something to another man crossing the yard, ordinary and unhurried, entirely unaware that anything unusual was happening on the other side of the glass. The whole world seemed to be going on exactly as it had a moment ago, except for the man across the desk, who had gone somewhere Ayanna couldn't follow. Ayanna said, now, from instinct, telling her that whatever was happening on the other side of that desk had nothing to do with her mother's references anymore, had nothing to do with any of the reasons she'd ridden 4 hours to get here. Something wrong. Calloway didn't answer, he sat there, the old photograph held in both hands now like something that might shatter if he gripped it too hard, staring at the face of a boy he hadn't seen in 21 years. The face was his own. The face was his own. Ayanna watched him sit there with the photograph trembling, just slightly, in hands that she'd bet had never trembled over anything in 20 years. A man who ran cattle and land and men without ever once, she guessed, having to ask permission for a single thing he wanted in this life. And now he couldn't speak, sir. She said it again, softer this time, Mr. Calloway. He didn't look up. Thumb moved over the cracked corner of the tintype. Low. Like he was afraid the image might come apart if he pressed too hard. 21 years of careful distance, suddenly worth nothing at all against one small square of tin. "Where did you get this?" he said. "It was my grandfather's. It's been in that satchel 3 years. Forgot it was even say his name. The words came out rough, not unkind. Rough. For the way a voice gets when it hasn't been asked to carry something this heavy in a very long time and isn't sure. First, it still can. Pragi, Ayanna said. Calloway's eyes closed. For a moment he didn't do anything at all. Didn't speak. Didn't move. The study around them had gone quiet enough that Ayanna could hear the clock on the mantel ticking, could hear her own heart doing something strange and fast against her ribs, because whatever was happening across that desk had nothing to do with a housekeeper's job anymore, and she knew it. When he opened his eyes again, they weren't looking at her, or they were looking somewhere else entirely, somewhere 21 years gone. "I was 23 years old," Calloway said finally, "riding dispatch between 2 camps that didn't trust each other and didn't much trust me either. Green as spring grass. Thought I knew this country, because I'd read about it in a letter from an uncle who'd never once set foot west of Missouri, and wrote like the whole territory was a story instead of a place. He was quiet a moment, Roar. And when he spoke again, his voice had gone somewhere far off, the particular distant tone of a man narrating a memory he hadn't let himself walk through in a very long time. It was colder than I expected, that far south. Nobody warns you about that back east. For they tell you about the heat, and forget to mention how the desert turns on you the moment the sun drops. I remember the cold more clearly than I remember the pain, if you can believe that. Cold enough my hands had gone half numb on the reins before the horse ever went down. He set the photograph down on the desk, carefully, like laying down something that might break if he wasn't slow about it. I got separated from my column in a wash south of here. Horse went down in the rocks. I went down with it. Brand drifted to his left side, low, near the ribs, for an old habit, worn smooth by 21 years of doing it without thinking. Bled through my shirt before I even understood I'd been shot. Fighting was bad that winter. Everybody scared of everybody, both sides seeing raiders in every shadow that moved wrong. A boy alone and bleeding in that country had about as much chance as a match in a rainstorm. And my grandfather found you. Your grandfather saved me. Calloway's voice cracked, slightly, on the word saved. And Ayanna watched a man who had not cried in front of another living soul in longer than she'd been alive, come within one breath of doing exactly that. He had every reason in the world to leave me there, his own people at war with mine, soldiers burning villages 40 miles from where he found me, men who looked like me doing the burning. And instead he carried me 2 miles on his back to a line shack nobody knew about, and packed my wound with something that smelled like sage and bitter root, and sat with me 3 days until the fever broke. He never told anyone. No, he never told me. For Ayanna heard her own voice go thin. Not once, not in 22 years of living under his roof, would you have believed him. Calloway's eyes found hers finally, steady again, for though something in them had shifted, gone soft in a way she didn't think this man's face knew how to do very often. For a white soldier, alive because of him, and never once came looking to say thank you, because I didn't know where to look. Because when the fever broke, I woke up alone in that shack with a canteen and enough dried meat to get me back to my column. And by the time I was strong enough to go looking for the man who'd saved me, the whole territory had gone up in smoke around both of us. And there wasn't a name left to search for. Memory of a face I couldn't put anywhere on a map until today. The clock ticked. Outside the window, Rattle moved slow across pasture that stretched to the mountains, entirely unaware that inside this room, a debt 21 years old had just found its way home. This isn't real. Except it is real. Except how is any of this real? A photograph in a bag she'd carried without thinking, and now the richest man in the territory sitting there with his hands shaking like a boy caught at something, except she'd only come here for a job. Stop, breathe, whatever this is, it's happening, standing here, disbelieving, it isn't going to make it stop. Is he? Wade stopped. Started on again, careful now, the way a man asks a question he's afraid of the answer to. Is he still out there, near your land? I'd like to. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. Ayanna felt something tighten in her chest. He passed 3 years back, she said quietly. Consumption. It took him slow, the way it does. We buried him on a rise east of the cabin, looking out over the flats, because he always said he liked to watch weather come in from up there. Wade went very still, differently still than before, not the frozen shock of recognizing his own face in a photograph, but something quieter and heavier, stillness of a man absorbing a loss that had happened to somebody else 3 years ago and had only just now, in this moment, become his to grieve as well. 3 years. He said the number like it had weight he had to set down somewhere before he could speak again. I had 18 years, Ayanna. 18 years between the day the fighting quieted enough that I could have gone looking, and the day he died, and I spent every single one of them telling myself there'd be time later. I built fences, I signed contracts. Proud myself next season, next spring, once things settle. His jaw worked once hard. And they never settled. 3 died 3 years ago on a rise east of your cabin. And I was less than a day's ride away the whole time, building a house bigger than any man needs, never once asking the one question that would have told me where to look. You didn't know his name. I could have found it. If I'd wanted to badly enough, I could have found it. It flat, felt pity in it. Just the plain accounting of a man who dealt in ledgers and had just discovered the largest debt of his life had gone unpaid, not because it couldn't be paid, Ford, because he hadn't tried hard enough to find where to send the payment. 4. That's the part I have to live with now. Not that I didn't know, that I didn't look hard enough to know. Ayanna didn't have anything to offer him for that. Brown grief didn't have a kind word that fit it, and she'd learned 3 years of carrying her own, not to insult a person's loss by reaching for one anyway. For he wouldn't have wanted you carrying this like a stone, she said instead. He told me once that some debts just get carried, man to man sometimes, so long the men forget they're carrying anything at all. I don't think he meant it as a complaint. I think he meant it as how the world works when it works right. You're carrying it now. That's not nothing. For Wade looked at her a long moment. Your mother, he said. He was already standing. Where? North of the flats. 4 hours ride. Less if we push it. Then we don't have 4 hours to spare, thinking about a debt 21 years old. 4. He was moving before he finished the sentence. Round the desk, toward the door. 4. And something in the set of his shoulders had changed entirely from the man who'd come down the stairs an hour ago, holding a newspaper. He wasn't in any hurry to finish. For a Halloran. The door hadn't fully swung open before the housekeeper appeared on the other side of it, close enough that Ayanna suspected she'd been standing there the whole time. Sir, fetch Harmon. Tell him bad fever. Bring everything he's got. For Calloway was already reaching for a heavy coat hung by the door, and have the covered wagon hitched now. 4. The Halloran's eyes flicked to Ayanna, back to Calloway, and something in her expression tightened into a shape Ayanna recognized immediately, because she'd seen it in that same face not an hour before in the front hall. If I may, you've got the railmen arriving. Mr. Ashford has already, outside. Ayanna could already hear the yard springing into motion, a boy's voice shouting for the team, the heavy creak of the barn doors being hauled open, hooves on packed dirt as someone led horses out at a run. The whole ranch seemed to move at Wade's command, the way a single body moves at the direction of its own hands. Practiced and immediate, no wasted motion anywhere in it. Can manage an hour without me. It's not an hour he's worried about losing, sir. It's the contract. Calloway stopped, looked at her, Martha. His voice had gone quiet in a way that was somehow louder than shouting. 4. There is a woman dying 20 miles from here, because I spent 21 years too comfortable to go looking for the man who saved my life, and he died 3 years ago while I was building fences and telling myself there'd be time later. I am not making that same mistake twice in one lifetime because a banker from Chicago doesn't like to wait. Halloran's mouth opened, closed again. Something passed behind her eyes that Ayanna couldn't quite name, not shame exactly, surprise exactly. Something caught in the narrow space between the two, and then she turned without another word and moved off down the hall, calling for the stable hands. Her voice sharp and fast in a way that suggested whatever she felt about it personally. She knew better than to argue further. For Calloway pulled the heavy coat on. Come on, he said, and this time it wasn't a command aimed at staff. It was aimed at Ayanna, and it came with something new in it, not the flat courtesy of an interview anymore, but the particular urgency of two people who had suddenly, unexpectedly, become partners in the same emergency. Ayanna didn't wait to be asked twice. 4. The west parlour doors were open when they crossed the hall, and the man standing inside them turned at the sound of footsteps with the bright, expectant face of someone who'd been rehearsing pleasantries for the last quarter hour and was eager to finally use them. Reginald Ashford, silk vest, gold watch chain, a bowler hat resting on the arm of a chair like it was too fine to touch the furniture directly. Silas, finally. Chicago men are due within the hour, and we still haven't gone over the... His eyes landed on Ayanna, and something in his face soured quick and unmistakable. Not now, Reginald. Not now. Silas, we've spent 3 months chasing this contract. If we don't sign today, the rail company takes their line 10 miles west, and every ranch between here and the border loses its shipping advantage, including this one. Frutch set down the folder he'd been holding, agitation plain in every line of him. I've had men in Chicago waiting on your word for a fortnight. I've turned down 2 other offers on your behalf, trusting you'd be here when it mattered. I know what's at stake. Do you? 4. Because it doesn't look like it from where I'm standing. Then where are you going? Calloway was already reaching for his hat off the rack by the door. 4. There is a woman dying north of the flats, he said, and I am going to see that she doesn't. And a debt I should have paid 18 years ago that I intend to start paying today, whatever it costs. Me, Ashford blinked, looked at Ayanna again, for longer this time. 4. And whatever calculation was running behind his eyes finished with a small, right shake of his head. Silas, I understand you're a generous man, but there are 100 sick women in this territory. You can't person one, I can. This is business, Silas. Real money. The kind that keeps this whole operation. Reginald. For Wade stopped at the door, and something in the stillness of him made even Ashford pause mid-sentence. Fran, I have spent 21 years building this operation on the theory that the money would eventually matter more than anything else standing in front of me. For I found out this morning exactly how wrong that theory was, and I found it out in the worst possible way a man can learn a thing like that. I am not going to stand in my own front hall arguing about a rail contract while that lesson is still this fresh. For I don't pretend to understand what happened in that study. You don't need to understand it. You just need to understand that I've made my decision, and it isn't changing because a train has a schedule to keep. Cancel it. The word landed flat and final. Ashford's mouth opened, closed, open again, for the way a man's mouth moves when it hasn't caught up yet to what his ears just heard. You cannot be serious. Tell them to come back next month. If they won't wait, they can buy their beef from someone else. $20,000, Silas. That's what walks out the door if you're not in that room today. Calloway had already reached the front step. He turned back once, and Ayanna watched something settle into his face that looked almost like relief, the particular relief of a man finally choosing the thing he should have chosen 21 years ago and had simply never made himself do. Then it walks, he said. From debts are worth more than $20,000, Reginald. I only just learned that myself, about an hour ago, and I learned it a good deal too late for the man who's owed it. I'd hate for you to take as long to learn it as I did. He didn't wait for an answer. Ayanna stood in the hallway a moment after he'd gone, turning over what she'd just watched happen. 4. A man had walked away from $20,000 in the space of a single sentence over a debt she hadn't even known existed until an hour before, for a family that had ridden onto his land as strangers that same morning. She didn't yet know what to make of it, whether it changed anything about who she understood herself to be in this territory, 4, or whether it was simply one man's private reckoning that happened, by chance, to have landed on her family's doorstep. Either way, there wasn't time to work it out, standing in a hallway. 4. The wagon lurched through the gate 10 minutes later, Calloway at the reins himself, for a greying doctor named Harmon, braced in the back with a black leather bag clutched against his knees like it might fly away. 4. And Ayanna wedged on the bench beside Calloway, watching the fence line blur past faster than she'd ever seen it move. For nobody spoke for the first mile, because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't sound small against the size of what they were racing. The wind came hard off the flats, cold enough to bite through wool. And Ayanna pulled her collar tighter and watched the horizon and tried, without much success, to keep her mind from doing the thing minds do. In moments like this, running ahead of the wagon, straight to the cabin, straight to the bed, where her mother might be worse. For it might be past the point where a doctor's bag could help at all. She's the same as you left her. She's the same as you left her. She has to be. Except that wasn't how fevers worked, and she knew it. 4. And the knowing sat in her chest like a stone the whole ride, for heavier with every mile. You said she's been sick 3 days. Calloway said, breaking the silence. Cries on the trail. 3 worse each one, coughing. Bad. Wet. Deep, like it's coming from somewhere lower than her chest ought to reach. Harmon leaned forward from the back, steadying himself against a jolt in the road. Fever high? Burns to the touch. Chills with it? Shaking? Yes. Harmon's jaw tightened. He didn't say what he was thinking, but Ayanna had lived poor long enough to read a doctor's silence, same as she read weather, and this silence didn't sit easy in her stomach. How much farther? Calloway asked. 2 miles, maybe less. He snapped the reins. Horses surged. 4, and the wagon rocked hard enough that Ayanna had to grip the bench rail to keep her seat. 4, and somewhere in the shaking and the wind and the cold, She caught herself praying, not in words exactly, just a raw, wordless push of feeling sent out toward whatever might be listening. Please. Not yet, not today, not after everything. The country blurred past in streaks of red rock and grey scrub, familiar ground gone strange at this speed, landmarks she knew at a walking pace now flashing by too fast to name. She found herself gripping the bench rail so hard her knuckles had gone white, and made herself loosen her hold, for a finger at a time. Because there was nothing to be gained from wearing herself down with tension before they'd even arrived. Harmon, behind her, was already laying out what he could from the jolting wagon bed, a length of clean cloth, small brown bottle, instruments she didn't recognize wrapped in oilcloth, preparing the way a soldier prepares before a battle he can't see yet but knows is coming. You've done this before, she said, more to fill the silence than out of real curiosity. 4 more times than I'd like to count. Harmon didn't look up from his work. Pneumonia doesn't care whose land it visits, miss. Rich or poor, it takes the same toll if it's given the chance. The only difference I've ever seen is how fast help arrives once it does. 4. Ayana turned that over in her mind and said nothing, because there wasn't anything to say to it that wouldn't sound bitter. And bitterness wasn't going to get her mother breathing easier any faster. 4. The land grew familiar again in the last mile. Landmarks she'd known her whole life sliding past at a speed that made even the ordinary feel strange. The mesquite stand her grandfather had once pointed out to her. Dry wash she'd led Copper through so carefully that same morning. Home had never once looked frightening to her before. It looked frightening now, every familiar shape suddenly, a thing that might be hiding bad news behind it. They smelled it before they saw it. Smoke. Free at first, but easy to mistake for a cook fire. Prepped cook fires didn't smell like this, didn't carry that acrid choking edge that meant something was burning that wasn't supposed to be. Ayana's head snapped up. She was already half out of her seat before the thought finished forming, straining against the wind to see over the rise ahead. That's from our place. Calloway didn't ask questions. Snapped the reins hard, and the horses broke into a run that rattled every bone in the wagon, and Ayana held on with white knuckles and watched the grey column of smoke climb thicker and darker as they crested the last hill. The storage shed was burning. Not the cabin, not yet, but close enough that the wind was already carrying sparks toward the roofline, and the shed itself. The shed that held what little grain and dried meat stood between the Weaver family and a hard winter was already half swallowed in orange. For Ma, Ayana was off the wagon before it had fully stopped, boots hitting the dirt hard, running toward the cabin door without a single thought for anything else. Elena was inside, coughing, frightened. But inside and breathing, and Ayana's knees nearly went out from relief right there in the doorway. The shed, Elena managed between coughs, eyes wide with fear that had nothing to do with the fever. Ayana, the shed, I know. I see it. Grant her. Calloway was already moving, shouting something to Harmon about staying with the patient, stripping off his heavy coat as he ran toward the burning shed with the particular speed of a man who'd fought fires before and knew exactly how fast they turned from bad to unstoppable. Ayana ran after him. Because there was grain in there, feed for the horse, dried meat that would need to last them through a winter they couldn't afford to lose. And because some instinct older than thought had already calculated the math of it, lose the shed, lose the winter, lose everything the fire didn't touch anyway. Water! Calloway was shouting, hauling the door of the shed open, despite the heat rolling off it in waves. Buckets. Anything. There was a rain barrel at the corner of the cabin, full, and Ayana was already there. Already hauling a bucket up and running with it, sloshing against her legs. And for the next several minutes the world narrowed down to nothing but heat and smoke, and the burn of her own lungs, and the rhythm of bucket after bucket thrown against flame that didn't want to go down easy. Her arms screamed. She kept throwing water anyway, because stopping wasn't a choice today, not with the shed's roof timbers starting to crack and pop overhead, not with the wind still gusting hard enough to carry sparks wherever it pleased. For a beam let go somewhere above the door, sudden and loud, and Wade's arm shot out and hauled her back a full step before the falling timber hit the ground where she'd been standing a half-second before, throwing up a fresh gout of sparks and smoke. Watch the roof, he said, breathing hard, Rot letting go of her arm right away. Fire doesn't warn you before it decides to come down. I had it. You didn't, he said it plain. No argument in his voice, just fact. Rot, nobody has it. In the middle of a thing like this. That's why you watch each other's backs instead. She didn't argue further. For there wasn't time. France and some small, stubborn part of her recognized France, for even through the panic, France, that he was right. For it took longer than it should have. For by the time the fire gave up its hold, Fred's back corner was a blackened ruin. Half the grain sacks scorched through, but the walls still stood, and the flames hadn't reached the cabin, and Ayana stood in the wreckage with her chest heaving, and her hands blistered, and her mind finally slowing down enough to ask the question that had been sitting underneath the panic the whole time. How does a shed catch fire in the middle of a cold, wet morning? Looked around and saw it, a wooden stake driven into the ground not 20 feet from the shed-scorched corner, new freshly cut, the wood still pale and raw where an axe had squared it off, strip of red cloth tied at the top, fluttering in the wind like it wanted to be noticed. She knew every inch of this land. She'd walked it since she could walk at all, and that stake had not been there yesterday. Frost, it was the first time she'd used his given name, and neither of them seemed to notice, because there wasn't room left in the moment for manners. Look at this. He crossed to her, wiping soot from his hands onto his trousers. Stake had a number burned into its side. And below the number, in a hand Ayana didn't recognize, for a line had been scratched. Property line surveyed. Rock 1000. For 882. Wrong, Ayana said. Her voice had gone very flat and very cold. That line runs 30 yards inside our fence. I've walked that fence 1,000 times. Spring right there, she pointed. Fran shaking slightly, whether from the fire or from something colder, settling into her now, she couldn't have said that's been hours since before I was born. Whoever drove that stake put it exactly where it needs to be to swallow the water source. From the cabin doorway, weak but listening, Elena's voice carried thin across the yard. Grain sacks, how many did we lose? Most of the back row. Ayana called back, not wanting to lie to her even now, especially not now. But maybe half what we had stored all told. Elena closed her eyes a moment, doing the same grim arithmetic. Ayana had already done twice over half a winter's grain, family with no reserve to spare, reason still months from turning warm again. For it was the particular math poverty forced a person to do even in the middle of a crisis that should have left of no room for anything but fear, the stubborn practical calculation of survival running underneath everything else. We'll manage, France said, though her voice didn't carry much conviction behind it, more habit than belief. We won't have to, Wade said, crossing toward the doorway. Whatever's lost here gets replaced. That's not charity, Mrs. Weaver. Restitution for a fire somebody set on my watch, one way or another, and I intend to see it made right, regardless of whose hand struck the match. Calloway crouched beside the stake, studied the burned lettering, his expression darkening with every second he looked at it. Brevet's land in October, he said, quiet, on a claim that's still 3 days from foreclosure. Somebody who already knows how this ends, Ayana said. Somebody who's already decided who the water belongs to, and just needs the paperwork to catch up to what he's already taken. They looked at each other. Neither one said the name yet. But it was sitting there between them. Same way the photograph had sat between them an hour, before a thing too large to speak out loud, until you were sure, absolutely sure, speaking, it wouldn't be the only mistake left to make. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, Wade said finally, crouching lower to study the ground around the stake. Scuffed dirt, faint print of boots that weren't Ayana's or Elena's. This wasn't a careless fire. Somebody wanted it to look like an accident and would have gotten away with that story clean, if we hadn't arrived when we did, and if you hadn't known this land well enough to spot a boundary that had no business being where it stood. 3 days from foreclosure, Ayana said, turning the timing over out loud. Whoever it is didn't want to wait and see whether the bank's paperwork went through clean. They wanted the water secured before anyone official had a chance to ask questions about where the new line came from. Which means they're either very confident, Wade said, or very afraid of somebody looking too closely before the foreclosure's final. Maybe both. He straightened, brushing dirt from his knees, and looked out at the scorched corner of the shed a long moment before speaking again. I want that stake pulled and kept, he said. Every mark on it. If this is what I think it is, we're going to need proof that doesn't depend on either of our word alone. Ayana pulled it free herself, working it loose from ground, still warm from the fire, and wrapped it carefully in a scrap of cloth before setting it in the wagon bed like evidence in a trial neither of them had yet decided how to bring. 4. Inside, Harmon worked over Elena of a man who'd done this 100 times and lost the patient often enough to have stopped pretending it didn't matter each time. Pneumonia, he said finally, straightening. Bad case. Lungs are filling. She needs heat, steam and medicine. I don't carry in this bag. He looked around the drafty cabin wind, still finding its way through the log gaps despite the fire Ayana had built back up, and shook his head. Cabin's killing her as fast as the fever is. How bad? Ayana asked, needing the plain word rather than the careful one. Truly, not the gentle version. Harmon considered her a moment before answering, the way a careful doctor decides how much truth a person standing in front of him can actually carry. Bad enough that another night in this cold might have been the night that decided it, he said. I won't lie to you and call it anything softer than that. She's strong, and strength counts for a great deal in cases like this. But strength isn't unlimited, and hers has been spent hard these last 3 days with nothing to build it back up. He'd been a battlefield surgeon once, or Ayana would learn later, long before he'd settled into the quieter work of tending ranch hands and their families. For it showed in the particular calm of his hands even now, the absence of any wasted motion, for a man who had long since made his peace with delivering hard truths plainly, because the alternative false comfort that left a family unprepared had cost him more, France, for over the years, than honesty ever had. Then she doesn't stay here, Calloway said. Elena's eyes opened, glassy fixed somewhere between the two of them. The ranch, Ayana said slowly, understanding arriving a half-second behind the words. You mean bring her to the ranch? I mean, I have a warm room, clean linens, and a doctor who can check on her every hour instead of once a week. Calloway was already moving toward the wagon, pulling blankets from the back. Unless you'd rather argue about pride while she gets worse. Ayana almost did argue. Pride was the one thing they'd always had, the one thing poverty hadn't managed to strip away. And something in her recoiled at the idea of accepting a rich man's guest room like a piece of borrowed charity, no matter how the day had already turned. Except her mother was shaking so hard the bed frame rattled with it. Except the fire outside had just proven, in the plainest terms possible, that somebody wanted this land badly enough to burn it toward them while they weren't home to stop it. Except there was no version of pride worth more than her mother's next breath. All right, Ayana said. They wrapped Elena in every blanket the cabin had, and carried her out between them, careful over the threshold, careful down the 2 worn steps her grandfather had built with his own hands the same summer he'd raised the walls around them. Elena's eyes stayed open the whole way, fixed on the cabin roofline as it receded behind her, the particular look of a person memorizing a thing they're afraid they might not see again, though she said nothing about it, and Ayana didn't ask. Into the wagon bed where Harmon had built a nest of quilts against the jolting road ahead. Ayana climbed in beside her, held her mother's hand the whole ride back, did not let go once, not even when the wagon hit rock and threw them both nearly off the bench, not even when her own arm went numb from the angle she was holding it at. Calloway drove. He didn't say much on the way back. But once, somewhere past the halfway mark, Ayana caught him glancing back over his shoulder, not at her, not exactly, but at the two of them together, mother and daughter, the way a man looks at something he's decided, quietly and without announcement, that he is now responsible for protecting, whatever it costs him a second time in one day. Room at the ranch was warmer than any room Ayana had ever stood in. Fire already crackling in the hearth by the time they arrived Halloran's doing, though the housekeeper said nothing when they carried Elena through the door. Only stood aside with her jaw set and her eyes carefully, deliberately, brought meeting Ayana's. Someone had laid out clean linens on the washstand and set a kettle near the fire, ready before anyone had thought to ask for it. Small evidence of a woman who had spent the ride to town and back turning something over in her mind and had chosen, in the end, to act on it quietly rather than say a word about it either way. Ayana noticed. She didn't say anything about it either. France. Some apologies arrived before the words that were meant to carry them. Greece. Respected was one of those. Clean sheets. A real bed, soft enough that Elena sank into it like the mattress itself might swallow her whole. Fran. Harmon worked through the afternoon mustard plasters, steam kettles, for medicine measured out in careful drops, and Ayana sat in a chair pulled close to the bed and did not move from it, for supper, for rest, rot for anything. France. Somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, between one dose of medicine and the next, Elena's eyes had cracked open, clearer than they'd been in days, and found her daughter's face in the lamplight. You made it, she rasped. To the ranch. Did they? Don't talk, save your breath for breathing. Ayana, I made it. Ayana took her mother's hand, careful of the fever still radiating off her skin, softer now than it had been that morning, but still present, still a warning. I'll tell you everything once you're stronger. It's a great deal to tell, Ma, more than I know how to fit into one afternoon. Elena's mouth had curved, faint but real. The ghost of the smile, Ayana, had grown up watching cross her mother's face at the end of every hard day, the one that said the day was hard but not unbearable, for not so long as the two of them faced it together. You always did take after him, Elena murmured, eyes already drifting shut again under the pull of the medicine. Never once knew when to quit a thing. Once you'd started it, I take that as a compliment. It was meant as one. She'd slept after that, deeper and steadier than she had in 3 days. And Ayana had sat watching the rise and fall of her mother's chest with a kind of fierce, exhausted gratitude that had no room left in it for anything else. For not even the questions piling up about the photograph, for about Wade, for about everything the day had already upended before it was even half finished. Braid found her there past dark, a cup of tea in each hand. Drink, he said, holding one out. I don't have coin for tea, it's not for sale. Something almost like a smile moved at the corner of his mouth, the first one she'd seen on him all day. Drink it anyway. She took the cup, wrapped both hands around it, more for the warmth than the tea itself. For a while neither of them spoke. The fire popped. Elena's breathing, rough but steady now, filled the quiet between them. And Ayana found herself watching it the way she'd watched everything else that day carefully. For like the smallest change might mean everything. You didn't have to do any of this, she said finally. I know. The wagon, the doctor, this room. She gestured at the space around them. The warmth of it, the impossible softness of it, against everything she'd woken up to that morning. You could have paid the debt with money and called it settled. Nobody would have blamed you. I would have, Ayana looked at him. Your grandfather didn't carry me 2 miles, because he calculated it was worth his while. Wade said, staring into the fire like the words were easier to say to it than to her. He did it because it was the right thing stand in front of him and he did it without once asking whether it would cost him anything. I spent 21 years telling myself the debt could wait until it was convenient to pay. Today it wasn't convenient, just was, and I've got 18 wasted years to make up for now, whether I like the arithmetic of that or not. That stake outside our shed, Ayana said. That wasn't an accident, no. Somebody wants that water. Wants it bad enough to burn a family out before the paperwork even says they can. Wade's jaw tightened. I intend to find out who, he said, and when I do, they are going to regret every single decision that led them to drive a stake into ground that wasn't theirs to survey. Ayana believed him, surprised her, for a little. How completely she believed him, a man she'd known for less than a day. For a man whose front hall she'd been thrown out of that same morning. But there was something underneath the polish and the money that reminded her, flashes, of the way her grandfather used to talk. Quiet certainty, the kind that didn't need volume to be taken seriously by anyone listening. Thank you, she said. For today. Don't thank me yet. Wade set his cup down, and for a moment something older and heavier moved behind his eyes. We're not finished paying this debt, Ayana. We're only just getting started, and I mean to see it through properly this time. What was he like? Ayana asked. Those 3 days you knew him. I only ever knew him as an old man telling stories on a porch. I never knew him young. Wade was quiet a moment, turning the question over the way he seemed to turn most things over before answering them. Steady, he said finally. Well, that's the word that comes to mind first. Not steady like a rock is steady, unmoving. Steady like a man who's already decided how he means to act no matter what happens around him, so nothing that happens can knock him off that line. For I remember waking up the second night, fever still back, certain I was dying, and he didn't tell me I wasn't. For he didn't lie to comfort me. He just said, "You're not dead yet, and a man's not dead until he's dead, so there's no sense spending the time between arguing about it." Then he went back to changing the dressing on my side, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. That sounds like him. I only had 3 days of him, Ayana. 22 years, minus whatever years before you could remember. I envy that. Plainly. I know that's a strange thing to say to his own granddaughter, given what those years likely cost your family compared to what my 21 years of comfort cost me. But I envy it all the same. They weren't easy years, Ayana said. I won't pretend they were, to make you feel better about the years you spent instead, but they were full ones. I'll say that much for them. That's more than a lot of full lives manage. Do you think he knew? Ayana asked the question, arriving before she'd fully decided whether she meant to ask it. That somewhere out there, the boy he carried had grown into all of this. She gestured, at the room around them, for the wealth of it, sheer improbable size of what had grown from a debt nobody had ever collected. Do you think some part of him wondered? Wade considered it a long while before answering. I'd like to think he didn't need to wonder, he said finally. I'd like to think a man like that did what he did because it needed doing, and let the rest of the world settle itself however it was going to settle, without needing the ledger to balance in his favour to feel it was worth the doing. But I won't pretend I know his mind, for I only had 3 days of it. Same as I said, you'd know better than I would. Whether that's the kind of man he was, it is, Ayana said, with no hesitation at all. That's exactly the kind of man he was. They sat with that a while, the fire between them doing most of the talking neither of them seemed to want to do out loud just yet. Later, long after Wade had gone, and the house had settled into the particular hush of a place where everyone but the watchful is finally asleep, Ayana lay on a cot Halloran had made up for her at the foot of Elena's bed, staring at a ceiling she didn't recognize, in a room warmer than any she'd ever slept in. Frowned. She couldn't settle her mind into rest, no matter how tired her body had gone. Too much had happened. In too short a span of daylight, and her mind kept circling back through it the way a hand keeps returning to a bruise to check whether it still hurts. A photograph, a debt, a fire, a crowd with a rifle at the gate. Her grandfather's face in a stranger's hands, and that stranger's own face gone raw with a grief that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with her at the very same time. She thought she should feel triumphant. She had saved the job, hadn't she? More than saved it, the job itself had turned out to be the smallest part of what this day had handed her. Except triumph wasn't the word for what she felt, lying here in borrowed warmth with her mother's ragged breathing filling the dark beside her. What she felt was something closer to unmoored, like the ground she'd known the shape of her entire life had shifted a few degrees underfoot, not enough to throw her, but enough that she'd have to relearn her balance before she trusted her own footing again. Because before this morning she had known exactly who she was in this territory. Poor, overlooked, occasionally despised, more often simply dismissed, which in some ways was worse. She had built a whole life around navigating that shape, the way a person learns to navigate a room in the dark by memorizing where the furniture sits. Now the furniture had moved, and she didn't yet know where anything was. What happens tomorrow? What happens once Mars well enough to travel, and there's no more excuse to stay under this roof? Does the debt end there? Does he go back to being the man who runs an empire, and we go back to being the family who nearly lost everything to it? Except that doesn't feel true either, except nothing about today has felt like it was building toward an ending. Felt like it was building towards something else entirely, and she didn't have a name for what that something else might turn out to be. She turned onto her side. Watched her mother's chest rise and fall in the low firelight, steadier now than it had been that morning, a small and enormous mercy all at once. Whatever comes tomorrow, she thought, at least there is a tomorrow to come. Or at least that much had been won today, regardless of everything else still unsettled around it. Somewhere past midnight, exhaustion finally won the argument her mind had been having with itself, and she slept. She woke before dawn out of old habit. The way a body raised to poverty never quite unlearns the instinct to rise before the work does, and found she couldn't lie still in the borrowed warmth a moment longer once her eyes had opened. For the kitchen was already stirring when she came down. For a young cook named Bess stood at the stove, sleeves rolled, working through a mountain of biscuit dough, with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd done it every morning of her working life. She startled, slightly, when Ayanna appeared in the doorway. Didn't expect anyone up this early. Miss Bess wiped a floured hand on her apron, eyes flicking over Ayanna with open curiosity rather than the careful blankness Ayanna had grown used to from most of the house's staff since arriving. "You're the one from yesterday," for the one who stood up to Myers's bunch. "That's me. Whole kitchen was talking about it before supper was even served." Bess turned back to her dough, though her attention stayed half on her visitor. I'd never seen anybody talk down a crowd like that, with just their own 2 feet planted on a porch step. Half the hands wanted to cheer, only nobody was quite sure if it was their place to. Ayanna found herself unexpectedly, almost smiling. "I wasn't doing it for a cheer. No, I don't imagine you were." Bess nodded toward a second bowl and a sack of flour sitting untouched at the end of the table. "You any good with biscuits, or are you just good at standing your ground?" "My mother taught me both, as it happens." "Then make yourself useful if you can't sleep. Anyway, idle hands in my kitchen make me nervous before sunup." Ayanna rolled up her sleeves and got to work, and for a while neither of them spoke, the comfortable kind of quiet that settles between 2 people doing familiar labor side by side. Was, she thought, first entirely ordinary hour she'd spent since leaving her own cabin the morning before no crowd, no ledger, no photograph trembling in a stranger's hands, flour and butter and the plain, steady rhythm of a task her hands already knew by heart. "You planning on staying once your mother's well?" Bess asked eventually, not looking up from her work. "I don't rightly know," Ayanna admitted. "Yesterday I only meant to be here long enough to hand over some letters and ride home before dark. Feels like a different life already, saying that out loud. Funny how fast this place can turn a person's plans around." Bess said it without much weight behind it, the idle observation of someone who'd likely seen the ranch turn a great many plans around over the years and had long since stopped being surprised by it. Callaway's like that. Decides a thing needs doing, and the whole world seems to rearrange itself around getting it done. Ayanna thought of the wagon. Fire, $20,000, walked out the door, without a second thought. Frowned, she couldn't disagree. By the time the biscuits went into the oven, the rest of the kitchen staff had begun filtering in for the day. And Ayanna caught more than one curious glance thrown her way some wary still. Simply curious. Few carrying something that might, with enough time, grow into something like welcome. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, whatever debt the territory owed her for yesterday's crowd, but it was a start, the same small or unremarkable kind of start. The woman on the road had offered her the morning before, and she found she was learning to recognize those starts now, wherever they showed themselves. She was still in the kitchen, flour on her hands, when the first rumor of the morning came drifting through the back door on the lips of a stable hand fetching his breakfast. The ordinary hour ended as quickly as it had begun. Rumor beat them to breakfast. Ayanna heard it before she understood what she was hearing, low voices out past the kitchen door, one of the hands saying something to another, the word Apache carried on the wind clear enough to catch even through a closed window. By mid-morning it had grown legs. By noon there was a crowd at the front gate. Ayanna watched it gather from the guest-room window, a knot of unease tightening slow in her chest with every wagon and horse that pulled up along the fence line. 10 men, then 15, farmers mostly. Few faces she recognized from town, for all of them carrying the particular stiff-shouldered posture of men who'd convinced themselves they were doing something brave. He'd seen this before in smaller versions. A murmur outside the mercantile that grew into a huddle. A huddle that grew, on a bad enough day, into something with a name and a direction. She'd learned to recognize the shape of it the way she recognized weather, the particular pressure in the air before a storm broke. Stillness that wasn't really stillness at all, but a held breath. Stay upstairs, she told herself. Let Wade handle it. He's the one whose name carries weight out there. Except staying upstairs had never once in her life made a crowd like that go away on its own. 4. Except hiding only ever taught them. They were right to come looking in the first place. One of them was shouting before Wade had even reached the porch. We heard you got one of them holed up in your house, Calloway. 4. Ayana's hand tightened on the windowsill until her knuckles whitened, because she knew that voice. Not personally, she'd never met the man, but she knew its shape, its particular texture, the same texture Halloran's voice had carried in the front hall the day before. Fear wearing the mask of righteousness. She'd heard it her whole life, in one form or another, and it never got any easier to stand under it and wait for it to pass. There a problem, Myers? For Wade's voice, carrying easy across the yard, unbothered in a way that Ayana suspected was costing him considerably more effort than it sounded like. Problem if there's an Apache woman sleeping under your roof, while half this territory's still burying folks from the last raid. A big man near the front of the crowd, red-faced, a rifle resting easy across his forearm like he wanted everyone to notice it was there. We got families out here, Calloway, women and children who don't sleep easy as it is. She's here because her mother's dying of fever, and I put them both under my roof. That's the whole of it. That's not how we heard it. Then you heard wrong, and I'd think a man who values his own family's safety would want the true account before he rode out armed onto another man's land over a rumour somebody else told him second-hand. 4. That landed harder than Wade's earlier words had. Ayana noticed from the window a few of the men shifting their weight, for the particular discomfort of people realizing partway through a righteous stand that the ground under it might not be quite as solid as they'd believed when they first mounted up that morning. Freckened man near the back of the crowd, older, grey in his beard, called out over the others. My cousin's whole family got burned out past Dragoon 2 summers back, Calloway. Ain't a man here doesn't have a story like it. You'd have us believe there's no cause for caution at all. I'd have you believe caution and cruelty aren't the same animal, Hollis, whatever you've convinced yourself of this morning. 4. The crowd shifted, 4. And somewhere in the shifting a third voice up, sharper, angrier than the first 2. 4. My brother didn't come home from the flats in 71. You want to explain to me why we're supposed to trust? Ayana was moving before she decided to move. Not brave, exactly. Certain, in the particular way fear sometimes clarifies a person instead of freezing them. Pratt standing at that window doing nothing was its own kind of answer, and not one she meant to give. Down the stairs, out the front door, past Halloran, who reached for her arm, and then, for reasons Ayana didn't have time to consider, let go of it instead, onto the porch, into the cold morning air, into a yard full of men who all turned at once to look at her. The way the whole territory had always looked at her like a verdict already reached, waiting for a formality to make it official. My name is Ayana, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Steadier, maybe, than it had any right to. I heard you, Myers said. Heard plenty. Then hear this too. She came down the porch steps, slow, deliberate, and stopped close enough to the gate that every man there had to actually look at her instead of at the shape of her from a distance. For my grandfather served this territory in the fighting. Not against it, for it. He pulled wounded men out of ground soaked in blood that wasn't his. White men, some of them standing right here today for all I know. And he never asked a single one of them what side they were on before he carried them to safety. Fine story. Pries said, echoing, without knowing it, the exact words Halloran had used the day before. It's not a story, it's the truth, and I can tell you every name I know of it, starting with the man standing on that porch. Ayana didn't look back at Wade. She didn't need to. 21 years ago, my grandfather found a wounded soldier bleeding out south of here and carried him 2 miles on his own back rather than leave him for the wolves. For that soldier is standing right there. Ask him yourself if you don't believe me. He'll tell you the same, because I watched it near Breakham this morning, just remembering it. Silence. Friars looked past her, toward the porch, toward Wade, who hadn't moved, or who was watching this unfold with an expression. Ayanna couldn't quite read something between pride and something rawer, something closer to grief, still sitting close to the surface. True, Calloway. Every word. He never told nobody, because he didn't do it to be thanked, Ayanna said. He did it because it was right, and that's the only reason a person like that ever needs. So before any of you decide what I am based on what happened to somebody's brother, ask yourselves how many of your own brothers, for your own sons, are alive today, because some Apache man made the same choice mine did, and never once got a name in the paper for it, and died 3 years ago, without a single one of them ever coming to say so much as thank you. The grey-bearded man, Hollis, shifted his weight, something working behind his eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. That's not the same as what happened to my cousin's family. No, Ayanna said, and something in her voice gentled, just slightly, enough to make the difference plain rather than argued. It isn't the same. Your cousin's loss is real, and I won't stand here and tell you it isn't, or that it doesn't earn you the right to be afraid. Fear that only looks in one direction isn't caution, Mr. Hollis. It's just fear that's found somewhere convenient to point itself. My grandfather bled for men who look like your cousin. That has to count for something, or none of this, none of what any of us have lost means anything at all. Nobody spoke. The wind moved through the gathered men. Somewhere behind her, Ayanna heard the cabin door creak. Elena awake, Harmon steadying her at the threshold, too weak to stand, but not too weak to be there, and something in the sight of that, for a mother and daughter both refusing to hide, screamed to take the last of the fight out of the crowd's shoulders. Myers lowered the rifle. Ayanna felt her knees go, slightly, now that the worst of it had passed, the particular weakness that arrives only once danger has receded far enough to be looked at properly, the body finally allowing itself to register what it had been too busy surviving to feel a moment before. She locked her legs and kept standing anyway, because the last thing she meant to give that crowd, even in retreat, was the sight of her faltering. He didn't apologize. Ayanna hadn't expected him to. But he lingered a moment after the others had begun to turn away, looking at her with an expression that had shed most of its earlier hostility, replaced by something closer to discomfort, the particular discomfort of a man realizing partway through a fight that he might have picked the wrong side of it. "Soldier, your grandfather carried," he said low, almost too quiet for the others to catch. "Reds. Some of them are still standing here today. You know that for certain, or just supposing?" "I know it for certain about one of them," Ayanna said. "I couldn't tell you about the rest. Nobody kept a list. That was rather the point of how he did it." Myers turned that over, jaw working, and didn't answer right away. "My father served with a scout during the worst of it, Fran," he said finally, reluctant, like the words cost him something to hand over. Never would say the man's name. Just said he owed him more than he could ever pay back, and left it at that whenever anybody asked. He settled his hat lower, an old habit of a man ending a conversation before it went further than he'd meant it to. Didn't think much of it, till just now. He didn't say anything more. Simply turned, mounted up, and rode off with the rest. But Ayanna watched him go and filed the exchange away carefully, the way she'd learned to file away every small crack of light that showed itself in an otherwise closed door. Turned, muttered something to the man beside him, and the crowd began slowly, break apart, horses turning, wagons pulling away, the whole gathered weight of the morning's fear dissolving back into the ordinary business of a territory that had 100 other things to worry about besides one woman standing her ground on a porch. Wade came down the steps once the last of them had gone. "That took more nerve than most men I've ridden with," he said. "I didn't feel brave. Nobody ever does in the middle of it." He looked out at the empty road. Dust still settling where the wagons had turned. That's usually how you know it counted. For Ayanna had heard most of it from the doorway. Too weak to stand unsupported, but not too weak to have caught the shape of what happened, And when Ayana came to sit with her afterward, her mother's hand found hers with a grip stronger than the fever should have allowed. You stood up to an armed crowd, France said, half wonder, half something that looked, in the lamplight, uncomfortably close to fear for her daughter's safety rather than pride in her courage. Somebody had to. That somebody didn't have to be you. Yes, it did, Ma. Ayana said it gently, but she said it plain, the way she'd learned to say hard things that morning riding out. If I'd stayed hiding upstairs, they'd have gone on believing whatever they wanted about us, and next time it might not have been words at that gate. Sometimes the only way through a thing like that is straight at it. Elena studied her daughter's face a long moment, something moving behind her own tired eyes that looked, finally, more like pride winning out over fear. After all, your grandfather would have stood exactly where you stood, she said. I only wish he'd been there to see it. Maybe he was, Ayana said. In whatever way a person can be, once they're gone. Elena's hand tightened around hers, and neither of them said anything more about it, because there wasn't anything left to say that the silence didn't already hold better. The cost came due that afternoon, for a rider arrived just past 3, one of Ashford's men, breathless, having covered the distance from town at a hard gallop. He found Wade in the yard and delivered his message without dismounting, like he wanted the words out of his mouth as fast as possible and gone. Cargo men had left on the noon train. The contract was dead. $20,000 gone. And with it, the rider said, wincing as he said it, Ashford's temper, which had apparently not improved with the news one bit. Wade took it without much visible reaction. Ayana, watching from the porch, saw something pass across his face that wasn't quite regret, something closer to acceptance. The particular calm of a man settling a bill he'd already decided, before the total came in, that he was willing to pay in full. You lost a fortune today, she said, once the rider had gone. I paid a debt today. Wade looked at her, and there was no bitterness in it at all, which surprised her more than the loss itself. Fortune will come back around, Ayana. It always does for men in my position. Some debts don't come back around twice. I already found that out the hard way once this morning. I wasn't going to gamble what's left of it on a train schedule. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and stood beside him a while longer in the cold afternoon light, and let the silence hold whatever it needed to hold. He disappeared into his study not long after, and didn't emerge again before supper. Ayana caught a glimpse of him once, passing the study door on her way back from checking on Elena Wade seated behind the desk, the old photograph propped against a stack of ledgers where he could see it, a half-finished letter in front of him that looked, from the doorway, like it had been started and abandoned more than once. He didn't notice her pass. She didn't disturb him. Some grief needed company, and some needed a closed door, and she was learning, over the course of one very long day, to tell the difference on a stranger's face as easily as she'd always been able to tell it on her own. That evening, Ayana found herself in the kitchen, unable to sit still in the guest room a moment longer while her mother slept, restless, with an energy she didn't have anywhere to put. The house had gone quiet in the particular way. Large houses go quiet after dark. The day's business finally settled. Most of the staff retired for the night, only the occasional creak of a settling timber or the distant low of cattle drifting through the walls to break the hush. Ayana had never lived anywhere large enough to have a quiet like that, a stillness with room enough in it to feel almost like its own presence. Halloran was there, working through a stack of household ledgers, at the long wooden table, a lamp burning low beside her, spectacles pushed up onto her forehead, the way people do when their eyes have finally given out for the day, but the work hasn't. Neither of them spoke at first. Ayana busied herself with a kettle, more for something to do with her hands than any real need for tea. And it was Halloran, finally, who broke the quiet, her voice smaller than it had been in the front hall the day before. Smaller than Ayana had thought that voice capable of sounding. I owe you an apology. Ayana turned. I said a cruel thing to you yesterday. Halloran went on, not looking up from the ledger in front of her, still moving out of habit, though her attention had clearly left the page. And I've been sitting with it since, which isn't the same as being sorry for the right reasons, I know, but it's a start, I suppose, and it's more than I gave myself credit for being capable of this morning. Why did you say it? The pen stopped. My husband, Halloran said after a long moment, and my boy. 19 he would have been this spring. Her voice caught, slightly, on the number, the way a voice catches on a wound that's healed over but never quite healed, right underneath the scar. There was a raid out past Antelope Wash 11 years back. I don't tell that story for sympathy. I tell it because it's the truth of why I said what I said, and you deserve the truth, same as I owed you the apology. Ayana set the kettle down. I'm sorry, she said. For your loss. Truly, I know you are. Halloran finally looked up, and her eyes were wet, though her voice stayed steady. Particular steadiness of a woman who had trained herself over 11 long years, never to let the grief all the way to the surface where it might show. My boy was going to work cattle for Mr. Calloway that very summer. First pair of proper boots waiting by the door for it. I still don't know rightly what to do with a pair of boots nobody ever wore. She stopped herself, pressed her lips together a moment before going on. I built a wall after. Told myself it was sense, not grief. Told myself I was only being careful. Same word Myers used out there at the gate this morning. And I believed it near as much as he does, right up until you stood on that porch and made a liar of both of us. It's easier to hate a shape than a person. Found, Ayana said, or echoing without quite meaning, to the thought that had been sitting in her own chest most of the day. Shape doesn't argue back. Halloran let out something that was almost a laugh, small and worn. You're wiser than your years, girl. I mean that as a compliment, though I know it doesn't always feel like one, having to be wise before you've had the chance to just be young. Have much choice in the timing of it. No, I don't suppose you did. Halloran wiped at her eyes. Risk. Businesslike. The way a person does when they've decided they've allowed themselves enough of a moment and mean to get back to the day's work. That's the trouble, isn't it? I built a wall a long time ago, and I built it out of grief instead of sense, and it never once occurred to me that the wall might be catching people who never had a hand in what happened to me at all. It's easier to hate a shape than a person. Shape doesn't stand on a porch and shame you into remembering it's a person underneath after all. It's not an easy thing to unbuild. No, Halloran looked back down at the ledger. It isn't, but I mean to start. Ayana came and sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them said anything more. The kettle ticked as it heated, the lamp flickered against the dark window. Ayana's eyes drifted, without much purpose, to the open page of the ledger in front of Halloran, columns of figures, dates, names of accounts, and something in the pattern of it caught her attention, the way an off note catches the ear of someone who's spent a lifetime listening carefully to everything around her, because listening carefully was one of the few tools poverty had ever handed her for free. That entry, she said, before she'd fully decided to say anything at all, the water rights line, third from the bottom. Halloran glanced down. What about it? It's dated October. Same month as a survey stake I found driven into my family's land yesterday morning, right before the shed caught fire. Ayana leaned closer, tracing the column with one finger, careful not to touch the ink. This says the ranch purchased water access from a claim north of the flats. That's not Calloway land. That's ours. Halloran went quiet in a different way now, the busy scratch of her pen finally fully stilled. Show me, she said. Ayana did. They worked through the ledger together after that, by careful page, Halloran flipping backward with a growing frown, while Ayana read each entry aloud, both of them chasing the same uneasy thread. For a payment in July, water access north parcel. Smaller one in May, prey fee, disputed boundary, resolved in the ranch's favour. Another in March, ordinary looking on its own, that Ayana might have passed right over it if she hadn't already learned, in the last day, exactly what an ordinary looking entry could be hiding underneath. There's a pattern to it, Fran said slowly, more to herself than to Ayana, finger moving down the page. Small amounts, never large enough on their own to draw a careful eye, but strung together, it's a great deal of land quietly moved, Ayana finished. All of it signed off by the same hand. Halloran turned back to the first entry they'd found, studying the signature at the bottom with new and considerably less charitable eyes. "I've seen this signature 100 times and never once thought to question it," she admitted. "The shame of it, isn't it? A man hides best in plain sight, doing the same small thing over and over until nobody thinks to add it all up." For Ayanna sat back in her chair, for the weight of the last 2 days, finally catching up to her all at once. The ride, fire, crowd, photograph, now this, fraud, large enough to reach past her own family's spring into who knew how many other quiet corners of the territory. She thought of the stake wrapped in cloth out in the wagon bed. She thought of Otis Pratt's smile, the one that had never once reached his eyes, standing in their yard 3 days ago, telling her nothing personal in this. For it had been personal all along. It just hadn't been personal to him the way it was personal to the families whose land he'd been quietly carving away, one small entry at a time. "We'll need more than this ledger," she said finally. "This shows money moving. But it doesn't prove the water was never his to sell in the first place." "No," Halloran agreed. "It doesn't, but it's a start, and I don't imagine either one of us is going to sleep easy tonight regardless." And in the lamplight, in the quiet kitchen, with Elena sleeping down the hall and Wade somewhere still awake in his study, working through the loss of the day's contract, 2 of them bent over a ledger together and began slowly, the outline of something neither of them had been looking for, something with Otis Pratt's signature at the bottom of it. Wade read the ledger 3 times before he said a word. Ayanna watched him do it, watched his finger move down the column, stop, go back up, stop again, for the way a man reads something when he's hoping, against all the evidence in front of him, that a second look might change what the first one found. It didn't change. The lamp had burned low enough that Halloran rose once to trim the wick, for her hands steady despite the late hour. Small, for ordinary motion seemed to Ayanna like the only thing in the room still behaving the way the world was supposed to behave, for everything else having tilted sideways sometime in the last 2 days and not yet found its way back level. "Pratt's been drawing water rights payments off Callaway accounts," he said finally, "for land that was never Callaway's to sell water from in the first place." He set the ledger down slow, like it had gotten heavier in his hands the longer he held it. Which means either my own accountant signed off on a fraud without knowing it, or knew and said nothing, or Pratt forged the signature, Halloran said quietly. "Wouldn't be the first entry in this book that doesn't sit right, now that I'm looking with different eyes." Because that was the thing about a lie built carefully enough. It didn't announce itself. It just sat there in a column of numbers, patient, waiting for nobody to ever look twice. Somebody finally did. "How long?" Wader on, flipped back, further, her mouth tightened with the page. 8 months at least, that I can see plain. Might go back further than that. I'd need daylight and a clearer head to be certain. 8 months. Wade said it like the number itself had teeth. For 8 months of a man sitting across my desk, shaking my hand, telling me the territory's boundaries were settled and quiet, while he was carving pieces off families who couldn't afford a lawyer to stop him. For I've spent 18 years not looking hard enough for one debt I owed. I don't intend to spend another day not looking hard enough at a man robbing people right under my own roof. "Not just us," Ayanna said. Both of them looked at her. "That stake by our shed had a survey number burned into it," she said. "A number means a system. A system means other stakes, other families." It felt something cold settle into her chest, colder than the fire and the fever and everything else the last 2 days had thrown at her combined. "Pratt's not just after our spring. He's been doing this quietly, piece by piece, to anyone too poor or too tired or too scared to fight back." The kitchen went quiet enough that Ayanna could hear the lamp wick hissing faintly where it burned low, because that was the shape of it now, laid out plain in lamplight. Not one greedy man chasing one piece of land, for a pattern. Slow, patient theft running years deep, hidden in ledger columns nobody thought to question. And Ayanna felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders, the way her mother's illness had settled 2 days before, not something she'd chosen to carry, something that was hers to carry now regardless. France, how many families, how many other daughters riding 4 hours through open country with nothing but a satchel and a prayer, never knowing the ground under their own feet, had already been quietly redrawn by a stranger's pen. Thought sat ugly in her chest, worse somehow than the fear she'd carried riding out that first morning, because fear for her own family she at least knew how to hold. It was something larger, something that belonged to the whole territory, and she didn't yet know how a person was meant to carry a thing that size. "We need proof," Wade said. "Real proof. This ledger shows money moving. It doesn't prove the water was never his to sell." "The original grant," Ayanna said, "my grandfather's discharge papers, the land certificate that came with them. Pratt says that certificate burned, Army Records Office fire. Pratt says a lot of things." Wade's eyes came up, sharp. "You think there's a copy?" Ayanna said, slowly, feeling her way through a memory she hadn't touched in 3 years. "From my grandfather never trusted a bank or an army office with anything that mattered. Rot once in his life. He kept his boots by the door in case he needed to run. He kept his knife within reach when he slept. A man like that doesn't hand his only proof of land to strangers in a records office and call it settled then. Where?" Ayanna closed her eyes. She could see him, sitting on the porch, working a piece of leather, the light going gold behind the hills. She could hear the particular creak of the third porch board, the one he always avoided stepping on out of some old habit. Nobody ever explained. Could see him rise, from evenings, and disappear behind the cabin for no reason she'd understood as a child, for 10 minutes, crack, before anyone thought to ask where. "For there's a rock formation behind our cabin," he said, eyes still closed, tracing the memory before it slipped. "For a hollow in it, high up, hidden behind a slab that looks solid until you know where to push. He used to go back there. I always thought he was checking traps." Her eyes opened. "I don't think he was checking traps." Wade was already reaching for his coat. "For it's near midnight," Halloran said. "Then we ride at first light," Wade said, "because if Pratt's already circling this family's land with survey stakes, he's not going to wait politely for us to find proof before he moves again." For he paused at the kitchen door, one hand on the frame, and looked back at the two of them a moment. "For whatever we find tomorrow," he said, "I want you both to understand something plain. This isn't only about your family's land anymore, Ayanna, much as I know that's the piece closest to your heart tonight. Pratt's done this once and gotten away clean. We'll do it again, and again. Somebody with the standing to make him stop finally does. For I mean to be that somebody, whatever it costs." "It already cost you $20,000 once this week," Ayanna said. "Then I suppose I'm developing a taste for expensive decisions." Something almost like humor moved at the corner of his mouth. "Tired, but real. I built this ranch, brick and board, thinking the size of it was the measure of the man who built it. I'm starting to understand I had that backward. The measure isn't the size of what a man builds, it's who he builds it for, once he's got enough to spare some. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to ask more of both of you than today did, and today asked a great deal." For he left them there in the lamplight, and Halloran closed the ledger slowly, carefully, for the way a person closes a book they know they'll need to open again soon. For Elena was awake when Ayanna came to check on her one last time before the house went quiet for the night, not fully strong, still pale, still thin, in a way that made Ayanna's chest ache every time she looked at her too closely. Awake and lucid and watching her daughter with eyes that had come back into focus after 3 days of fever fog. "You look like you've been carrying the whole territory," Elena said, voice rough but steady. "Maybe I have. Sit." Ayanna sat on the edge of the bed. Told her everything, the photograph, the debt, the 18 wasted years, fire, crowd at the gate, ledger, fraud, stretching wider than either of them had imagined that morning, and watched her mother's face move through each piece of it, like a woman reassembling a shattered plate, careful cracking each fragment against the last before setting it down. For Elena listened without interrupting, the particular quiet attentiveness of a woman who had spent a lifetime letting other people finish their thoughts before offering her own. And when Ayanna finally ran out of words, the silence between them held for a long moment before either of them broke it. "Great deal to have happened in 2 days," Raina said finally, half wonder, half something warier. "For I sent you out to interview for a housekeeping position. I don't quite know what to make of the fact that you've come back running toward a fraud investigation instead. Neither do I, truthfully. Are you frightened? Brianna considered the question honestly before answering, the way her mother had taught her to consider most things worth answering at all. Some, she admitted, not of Pratt particularly. More of how much has changed in such a short span. A great deal to hold on to all at once. Your grandfather, Elena said, when Ayanna finished, used to say a thing to me before you were born. Her hand found Ayanna's, weak but certain in its grip. He said, paper burns, water dries, land shifts, but a debt owed in blood outlives all three, if the man who owes it has any honour left in him at all. He was talking about Wade. He was talking about everyone. Trina's eyes drifted, briefly, toward the window, toward the dark shape of the mountains beyond it. For he carried more men off that ground than he ever told either of us. I think some part of him always believed one of them would come looking. Someday. I think some part of him waited for it. Right up until he died. And never said so, because waiting out loud felt too much like asking. He never got to see it. No. Elena's grip tightened. But you did. And that's not nothing, Ayanna. That's not nothing at all. Wade said he had 18 years he could have looked and didn't. Carrying that hard, Ma. I watched it land on him tonight like a physical weight. Good, Elena said, with a flash of the old sharpness that had raised Ayanna through every hard winter they'd survived together. Let him carry it a while. For a debt that costs nothing to acknowledge isn't much of a debt at all. What matters now isn't how heavy the guilt sits on him. It's what he does with his hands while it's sitting there. He's already done more than most men would. I'm not saying otherwise. I'm saying guilt is easy, Ayanna, in its own strange way. It feels like doing something, sitting with a heavy conscience, when really it's just a man keeping company with his own regret. Action is the harder thing. For I'd rather see him build something that outlasts his guilt than watch him nurse it forever, however sincerely he means it. Ayanna turned that over, recognizing in it the same plain, through unsentimental wisdom that had steadied her through every hard decision of her own life. He wants to call it something, she said. A trust to help other families. He hasn't settled on the shape of it yet. Then help him settle it. For Eleanor's eyes had begun to droop, the medicine and the long conversation finally pulling her back towards sleep, but her grip on Ayanna's hand didn't loosen. For you've got your grandfather's sense for what's right and my sense for what's practical. Between the two of us, we ought to be able to steer one guilty rancher towards something worth building. 3 weeks later, once the fever had fully broken and Elena's strength had returned enough that Harmon finally pronounced her out of danger for good, Wade laid a small stack of papers on the desk in his study and slid them across to her without much preamble. For I'd like you to run the books, he said, officially. Wages, not favours. 4. I've watched you catch discrepancies in 2 weeks that my own clerk missed for the better part of a year, and I'm not in the habit of letting talent like that walk out my door, because pride's too proud to accept a salary. Elena studied the papers a long moment, and Ayanna, watching from the doorway, saw something cross her mother's face that she hadn't seen there in longer than she could remember, not gratitude exactly, though there was some of that in it, but something closer to recognition, the particular satisfaction of a person being seen clearly for a skill they'd always known they had and rarely been given the chance to use. 4. I'll want it in writing that I answer to nobody's convenience but the ledger's, Elena said. I've kept house for men who thought a smile could substitute for an honest wage before. I won't work that way twice in one lifetime. Agreed, Wade said, and something almost like a smile crossed his face. I suspect you and Halloran are going to get along very well on that particular point. Eleanor signed the papers that same afternoon. 4. And by the following week had already reorganized 3 years of the ranch's accounts into a system so clear. Even Wade admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he finally understood where half his own money had been going. For Ayanna pressed her forehead against her mother's hand and let herself finally, just a moment, stop being the one who had to be strong. They rode out at dawn. Wade, Ayanna, and Halloran the housekeeper insisting, firmness that surprised everyone including herself, that she was coming along, because she'd spent 11 years letting grief decide who she trusted. And she wasn't about to let it decide this too. The morning was cold and still. the kind of hush that settles over open country right before the sun properly clears the ridge. And Ayana rode the whole 4 hours back toward her own land with a strange, doubled feeling in her chest, the same trail she'd ridden in fear and desperation 2 days before. For now carrying her back toward it with a rancher and his housekeeper at her side. Proof they were hunting for, instead of a job they were hoping to save. 4. What if it's not there? What if he moved it, or the years wore the hiding place open, or some animal got in and ruined it past reading? Because she'd built the whole plan on a child's memory of a grown man's habits, and children remembered things wrong sometimes, didn't they? 4. Except she didn't think she'd remembered this one wrong. Except there was only one way to find out for certain. And 4 hours of doubting it on horseback wasn't going to change the answer either way. She kept riding. Halloran, for her part, said little the whole way, riding a length behind the other two with the particular quiet of a woman still working something out in her own mind. For once, crossing the same rocky wash where Copper had stumbled 2 days before, she called ahead to Ayana. "You've made this ride twice now in 3 days," she said. "How are you not falling out of the saddle from exhaustion?" 4. I stopped keeping count of the exhaustion somewhere around. Yesterday morning, Ayana called back. Seemed like the only sensible thing to do with it. Halloran's laugh, when it came, short and surprised. For like she hadn't fully expected herself to still be capable of the sound after everything the week had put her through. For the cabin looked smaller than Ayana remembered, though she'd only been gone 2 days. Smaller, and somehow more precious for it, standing quiet in the pale morning light with the scorched corner of the shed still black against the rest of the yard, Jake's absence, leaving a small bare wound in the dirt where they'd pulled it free. She led them behind it without hesitation. For the rock formation rose up grey and weathered, veined with old cracks, the kind of shape that had probably stood exactly like that, since long before any family had a claim to the land around it. For Ayana walked its base slowly, one hand trailing along the stone, chasing a memory instead of a landmark. "Fear," she said finally, stopping at a slab that looked, to anyone else, for like nothing more than a seam in the rock. For she pushed. "Please be here. Please, because if it isn't, we've got nothing but a ledger and a stake and a stranger's word against a man who's already proven he knows how to make paperwork disappear when it suits him." For it gave. For not easily years of settling had wedged it tight, but it gave, grinding back on some old ridden pivot, revealing a hollow no bigger than a bread box, dry and dark and untouched. Pride, wrapped in oilcloth, gone stiff with age, sat a folded stack of papers. Ayana's hands shook as she pulled them free. For a moment she couldn't make herself unwrap the cloth, from superstitious fear rising in her that opening it too fast might undo the small miracle of its simply being there at all. 3 years untouched. For exactly where a 12-year-old girl's half-remembered curiosity about her grandfather's evening walks had told her it might be. For Wade crouched beside her while she unwrapped the cloth. And together they looked down at the original discharge papers, Taji's name, officer's signature, a date, and beneath it, certificate of land grant. Boundaries drawn plain and unmistakable, spring marked clear as day inside the family's line. "France," Wade said quiet. "That's everything. He kept it," Ayana whispered. "All these years, he kept it. 'Cause paper burns." Elena's words came back to her. For unbidden, for unless somebody makes sure it doesn't. Praran, standing a little apart, wiped at her eyes with the back of one gloved hand and said nothing at all, was, from a woman like her, her own kind of testimony. For there's something else in here, Braid said. And Ayana looked over to see him carefully unfolding a second, smaller paper tucked behind the land, grant a short letter, handwriting, unmistakably her grandfather's, though she'd never seen it before. For uneven, and careful the way a man writes, who learned his letters later in life and never quite trusted his own hand with them. He read it aloud. "Slow. If anyone ever comes looking for the soldier I carried off the flats that winter, tell him the debt was never his to carry alone. Tell him a man who lives is a man who still has the chance to do right by someone else someday. For that was payment enough for me. I never needed more than that. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Ayanna reached out and took the letter gently from Wade's hands, reading the uneven lines herself, tracing her grandfather's careful, unpracticed script with one finger the way she'd once seen him trace old maps by lamplight. Strange, for hearing his voice in ink rather than memories strange and precious both, for a piece of him she hadn't known existed until this exact moment, surfacing 3 years after she'd thought she'd already said her last goodbye to every part of him she'd ever get to keep. For he knew, Ayanna said finally, wonder threading through the words. He knew somebody might come looking some day. He left this for that exact moment and never told a soul it was here. He forgave the debt before it was ever collected, Wade said, his voice unsteady. Before I even knew there was one to forgive. That doesn't mean you stop paying it, Ayanna said. I don't think that's what he meant by it. No, Wade agreed, folding the letter with careful hands. I don't think it is either. He tucked the letter carefully back inside his coat, close the way a man carries something he means to keep near him, rather than filed away. And Ayanna understood, watching him do it, that whatever else came of the weeks ahead, her grandfather's handwriting had already found a permanent home somewhere close to this stranger's heart, for exactly the way it had always lived in her own. Pratt arrived at the Calloway Ranch 2 days later, exactly on schedule, exactly as arrogant as a man who believes the paperwork is already settled in his favor. He came with 2 men Ayanna didn't recognize, and a folder of documents he carried under one arm like a weapon he was looking forward to using, and he found the front hall considerably more crowded than he'd expected. Wade was there. Ayanna, Halloran, Raina, still weak but upright, seated in a chair by the hearth with a blanket over her knees and a look on her face that Ayanna had rarely seen there before, something sharp and unyielding. The look of a woman who had survived enough now to stop being afraid of one more fight. And beside them, unexpectedly, Reginald Ashford, bowler hat in hand, standing a little stiffly near the window, having ridden out that same morning on some business of his own that Ayanna didn't yet understand, and finding himself, by accident of timing, present for something considerably larger than a lost railroad contract. Pratt's steps slowed as he crossed the threshold, taking in the size of the gathering, some small flicker of unease crossing his face before he smoothed it back into practiced confidence. Quite a welcoming party, he said, for a routine matter of foreclosure. Calloway. Pratt's smile arrived a half-second before his eyes did, the way a smile does on a man who's practiced it more than he's felt it. I understand there was some trouble out at the Weaver claim. Fire, I heard. Shame. Was a shame, Wade agreed. Especially given the stake somebody drove into the ground right before it started burning. Pratt's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. I don't follow, I think you do. Wade crossed the hall, and hurried, and set the ledger down on the small table between them, open to the marked page. Water rights payments, 8 months running, drawn against a claim that was never yours to sell from. That claim was in foreclosure. Claim, Ayanna said, stepping forward, was never legally in default at all. She set the oilcloth-wrapped papers down beside the ledger. Pratt's eyes moved to them, and for the first time since he'd walked through the door, something in his composure genuinely cracked. He's going to deny it. He's going to find some clever turn of phrase and slip out from under this the way he's slipped out from under everything else. Except the papers are right there. Except 6 families' worth of proof is standing in this room. Except, where did you... Doesn't matter where, Wade said. What matters is what they say. My grandfather in honours discharge papers. Original land grant. Dated and witnessed. Boundaries drawn clear as anything. Spring included. He let that sit a moment. Funny thing about a fire that supposedly burned records at an army office, it didn't burn the copy the man kept himself, because he never trusted paperwork he couldn't hold in his own 2 hands. This is absurd. Pratt's voice had climbed half a register, thin at the edges now. One document doesn't undo a legitimate survey. No, Wade agreed, but a legitimate survey doesn't move a boundary 30 yards to swallow a water source the week before a fire either. And it doesn't explain 8 months of payments to an account with your signature on it for rights you had no legal claim to sell. Pratt looked around the room. At Wade. At Ayanna, standing straight-backed and unflinching. 4. At Halloran, who met his eyes without a flicker of the deference he was clearly used to receiving from her. At Elena, thin and pale but sitting upright, watching him with an expression that had survived far worse than one nervous land agent's temper. You have no proof of intent, he tried. A stake, a ledger entry, circumstance. I have a witness who watched you nail a foreclosure notice to that family's door 3 days before the deadline you'd already told them about, Wade said. 4. I have a housekeeper who found the entries herself, unprompted, and can testify to when and how she found them. 4. And I have half a territory's worth of families, Pratt, 4, who are going to want to know whether their land's been quietly surveyed out from under them too, once this gets talked about in town. 4. Which it will. You're bluffing, am I? Wade's voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone hard as flint. Try me and find out. I've already lost $20,000 this week, making a point about what matters more to me than money. Promise you, Pratt, ruining your standing in this territory is going to cost me considerably less. Ashford, silent until now, finally spoke. I'll add my voice to that, he said, and something in his tone had gone entirely serious, stripped of the polish it usually carried. I came out here to apologize for pushing you on a contract while a woman lay dying, Silas. I didn't expect to find something considerably uglier than a missed deal, but I've done business with men like Pratt before. I know the shape of it when I see it. 4. And I won't be doing business with this territory's rail contracts through anyone who's been quietly robbing the families that live on it. Ayanna would think later. For the moment, Ashford's presence in the story shifted from obstacle to ally. 4. Though neither man made any great show of the change. 4. In the weeks that followed, he returned to the ranch more than business alone required, twice bringing contacts from Chicago who proved willing to invest in the trust's work directly, rather than merely in cattle and rail lines. 4. And once arriving with nothing more than a bottle of good whiskey and an offer to sit with Wade through an evening, neither of them wanted to spend alone with the accounting of what Pratt's fraud had truly cost the territory. Strange thing, losing a contract, Ford told Ayanna once, watching Wade cross the yard toward the barn. I've never once seen a man come out the other side of it richer for the losing, until this year. Pratt's jaw worked. He looked, France, one more time, at the papers on the table at proof he clearly hadn't believed could exist, folded neat and undeniable in front of a room full of witnesses who had stopped France in for being afraid of him. 4. You'll regret making an enemy of me, he said. 4. Though the words came out thinner than he probably intended. 4. More habit than threat. No, Wade said. I don't believe I will, but I imagine you're about to learn a great deal about regret yourself in the weeks ahead. Pratt's eyes cut toward Elena, then Ayanna, some last calculation running behind them. Perhaps we could discuss terms privately. I'm certain a man of your standing understands there's value in a quiet resolution over a public one. There's nothing quiet left to resolve, Ayanna said. You made certain of that yourself the day you drove a stake into ground you knew wasn't yours and set a fire to cover the timing of it. I never touched a match. Maybe not with your own hand, Wade said. We'll let the land office sort out exactly whose hand did what. I suspect they'll be considerably more thorough about it than you're hoping. Pratt reached for his hat. This isn't finished, he said. No, Wade agreed. It isn't, because every foreclosure you've filed in the last 8 months is going to get reviewed. For every survey stake is going to get checked against the original grants they claim to replace. And every family you thought was too poor or too tired to fight back is about to find out they had more allies than you ever counted on. Pratt left without another word. Nobody moved until the sound of his horse had faded entirely from the yard. Then, all at once, the room seemed to exhale. Elena's shoulders dropped from where they'd been held rigid throughout the entire confrontation. Halloran crossed to the hearth and busied herself needlessly with the fire, the way people do when a body needs something to occupy its hands after holding still too long under tension. Ashford let out a low whistle and reached for his hat, muttering something about needing considerably stronger tea than the house had offered him that morning. Well, Elena said finally, breaking the quiet with the particular dry humour that had carried her through every hard season of her life. I don't believe I've ever watched a man's whole fortune come apart in under 10 minutes before. For I can't say I'm sorry to have witnessed it. Neither am I, Wade said, though something in his voice suggested the moment had cost him more than the easy satisfaction of victory alone. I keep thinking of how close we came to never catching it. For if you hadn't noticed that ledger entry, Ayana, if your grandfather hadn't kept that copy hidden all those years, how many more families would he have quietly ruined before somebody finally looked closely enough to stop him? But we did notice, Ayana said. For that's the part worth holding on to tonight, not the part that might have gone differently. Wade nodded slowly, for though the shadow of the thought didn't fully leave his face, and Ayana understood, for watching him, that some debts of vigilance never fully settled themselves, that a man who'd once been too comfortable to look for one thing lost might spend the rest of his days looking a little too hard at everything else. And there were worse habits a person could carry forward. 4. The weeks that followed moved faster than Ayana would have believed possible, given how slow the last 3 years had felt. Wade sent riders to every ranch and claim within 30 miles, asking a simple question: had anyone else seen a stake like the one behind the weaver shed? Survey dated later than it should have been, for a boundary drawn different than they remembered. The answers came back steady, and each one landed heavier than the last, for it took nearly 3 weeks to gather the full picture. Riders returning each evening with fresh reports, for Eleanor cataloguing every claim in a growing ledger of her own devising, cross-referencing dates and names until the pattern of Pratt's scheme stood out clear as a map. Some families had known something was wrong and simply lacked the standing to say so. Others hadn't known at all, trusting paperwork they'd never thought to question, because questioning it had never once occurred to them as a right they were entitled to exercise. There was a widow named Consuela Ortiz, through claims east, who'd lost the better part of her western fence line to a survey she'd never been notified of, filed while her husband lay dying of the same fever that had nearly taken Elena. 4. There was an old freedman named Amos Carter, running a small herd south of town, who'd been paying water fees for 8 months to an account he'd never questioned, because Pratt himself had personally assured him it was standard practice for the whole district. 4. There was a family of 5 Delgados, who'd very nearly lost their well entirely, braved only by the fact that the youngest boy had happened to be digging near the property line the same week Pratt's men came through with their stakes, and had mentioned the strange visitors to his father out of simple curiosity rather than any suspicion at all. Families in all. 6 claims quietly shrunk, one water source or fence line at a time, for over the better part of a year, each too small a theft on its own to draw much notice, each one carefully aimed at people with no money for lawyers and no standing in town to be believed if they complained. For Ayana rode out to each of them personally. Once word had spread enough for the families to trust a visit wasn't some new trick. Consuela Ortiz cried when she saw the papers proving her fence line restored, gripping Ayana's hand so hard it left marks, to saying over and over in a mix of Spanish and English that she'd stopped believing anyone would ever come. She insisted on feeding Ayana a full meal before she'd allow the conversation to move on to business. And by the time Ayana finally rode home that evening, she carried with her not only signed papers but a small jar of preserves pressed into her hands at the gate, a gift Consuela refused to let her refuse. Carter simply nodded, slow and steady, when Ayana laid the truth out plain in front of him. Foreign said he'd suspected something wasn't right for months, but hadn't had the standing to say so out loud, not as a black man, in a territory that had never once given him the benefit of the doubt on anything. For he'd kept his own careful records of every water payment he'd made, tucked away in a tin box under his bed, for a habit born of a lifetime spent knowing his word alone would rarely be trusted against a white man's. Those records, once handed over, became some of the strongest evidence that trust would gather against Pratt in the weeks that followed. For the Garda boy, the one who'd noticed the strange men with their stakes, beamed with pride the whole visit, certain in the particular way of children that he'd personally solved the entire affair. And followed Ayana around the yard, peppering her with questions about copper and the ranch, and whether Mr. Calloway really was as rich as everyone said, until his mother finally called him off with an exasperated but fond shake of her head. Older sister quiet girl of perhaps 10 named Rosa, hung back during that first visit, watching Ayana with the particular careful attention of a child sizing up whether a stranger was safe to trust. 4. Ayana noticed France and made a point. 4. Before she left that day, crouching down to Rosa's level rather than towering over her the way most grown visitors did. 4. You've got a good eye, Ayana told her. Your brother gets the credit for spotting the stakes, but I'd wager you're the one who noticed something was wrong first and just didn't have the words for it yet. Am I right? Rosa's eyes had gone wide, startled at being seen so precisely by someone she'd only just met. She nodded, slow. That's not a small thing, Ayana said. Noticing before you can explain why. 4. My own grandfather used to say that's where all the real understanding starts. The noticing comes first, and the words catch up later if you're patient with yourself. She'd visited the Delgado claim twice more in the months since. 4. And each time Rosa had grown a little bolder, for asking sharper questions, for once even pointing out a discrepancy in a neighbouring boundary marker that the trust hadn't yet caught on its own. Ayana found herself, watching the girl work through the problem with quiet, methodical care, thinking of herself at that same age, sitting on a porch while an old man taught her to read the land the way other children were taught to read books. Some things she was learning didn't end with the person who first taught them. They simply found a new pair of hands to keep moving through. For Wade brought every one of them into it, not with charity, though there was plenty of that too, wagons of supplies and doctors' visits and quiet notes forgiving debts that had never been fair to begin with. 4. But with something Ayana suspected mattered more in the long run, with witnesses, with proof, with a rancher whose name carried enough weight in that territory that a land office finally had to listen when 6 separate families showed up at once with the same story. 4. It hadn't all gone smoothly between them in those first weeks of building something neither had ever built before. They'd argued once sharply over how quickly to bring the Carter case forward, Wade wanting to wait until every piece of corroborating evidence stood airtight, Ayana insisting that waiting too long risked letting Pratt's influence do more damage in the meantime, that sometimes the perfect case mattered less than the timely one. 4. You're thinking like a man with money enough to never worry about running out of time. She'd told him more heat in it than she'd meant to let show. Amos Carter's been carrying this quietly for 8 months already. For every week we wait for a stronger case is a week he keeps paying fees on rights that were never real. Wade had been quiet a moment, and she'd braced for the particular offence of a rich man unused to being challenged in his own study. Instead he'd nodded. Slow. You're right. I built this ranch making careful, patient decisions, and it served me well enough building cattle empires. 4. It's not always the right instinct for people who don't have the luxury of patience. He'd rubbed a hand over his jaw. I'll need you to keep telling me when I'm thinking like that. I won't always catch it myself. 4. I intend to. France, for Ayana had said France, and meant it. 4. And something in the exchange had settled a question. She hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying whether this partnership was going to be one where her voice actually shaped the work, or one where she was simply given a title and expected to nod along. She'd gotten her answer, plain and immediate, and it had made her trust the whole enterprise a good deal more than any speech could have. Pratt did not stay in the territory long after that. Ayana didn't ask where he went. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't much care. 4. There was a kind of peace in that, in realizing that the man who'd tried to burn her family off their own land had shrunk, in the space of a few short weeks, into something small enough not to matter any more. 4. The land office in town, however, proved less easily satisfied than Pratt's departure alone might have suggested. 4. A clerk named Whitfield, thin and precise and clearly uncomfortable with the amount of attention suddenly falling on records he'd long treated as settled business, spent the better part of 2 weeks raising objections to nearly every claim the trust brought forward. 4. The Ortiz papers were questioned on a technicality of dating. The Carter water records were dismissed at first as the informal bookkeeping of a man Whitfield seemed disinclined to take entirely at his word. For even Taji's original land grant, plain and witnessed as it was, drew a raised eyebrow and a request for further verification that Ayana suspected would never have been asked of a claim bearing a different kind of name. I'm not disputing the document's age, for Mr. Calloway, Whitfield had said during their second meeting, for adjusting his spectacles with the particular fussiness of a man who mistook procedure for principle. For I'm simply noting that verification of provenance for grants of this vintage requires corroborating exactly what you'd accept without a second thought from any rancher whose grandfather rode in a blue coat instead of a Union Scout's coat. For Ayana had cut in, no longer willing to sit quietly through the third round of the same polite obstruction. I'd like you to say plainly, Mr. Whitfield, for whether the objection is to the paper, for to whose name is written on it. For Whitfield had gone red and blustered something about procedure being procedure, and hadn't managed a satisfying answer either way, though Ayana noted the objections came considerably faster after that exchange than they had before it. This is exactly how it happens, Wade said grimly, for after the third such meeting had ended in polite, for a maddening delay, for not with a rifle at the gate, with a man behind a desk deciding quietly whose paperwork deserves the benefit of the doubt and whose doesn't. Then we make it impossible for him to keep deciding that way, Ayana said. She spent the better part of a week gathering every scrap of corroborating evidence. She could find sworn statements from neighbours who remembered the true boundary lines. A surveyor from the next county, overwilling to independently confirm the original markers, for even a letter from one of the old soldiers at the ceremony who'd served alongside men who could vouch for the authenticity of discharge papers from that era. Laid it all in front of Whitfield's desk in a single sitting, methodical and complete, and watched the clerk's objections run out of road one by one until there was nothing left for him to raise. He approved every claim within the week. For it wasn't triumphant exactly, the way the confrontation with Pratt had been. For it was slower and duller and considerably more exhausting, the particular grinding work of forcing a reluctant system to do the plain, obvious, right thing it should have done without needing to be forced at all. But Ayana found, watching the approved papers finally get filed, that this quieter victory sat just as deep in her chest as the louder one had. She rode out to the old cabin alone, one evening not long after, for the first time since the fire. Red had been rebuilt by then, Wade's men making quick work of it, once the trust's other business had settled enough to spare the hands, and new grain sat stacked where the old had burned, and the cabin itself stood exactly as it always had, small and weathered and entirely, stubbornly theirs. And Ayana stood in the yard a long while just looking at it before she made her way up the rise behind the house, to the place where they'd buried her grandfather 3 years back. For the grave marker was simple. A flat stone Alina had chosen because Taji had never once cared for ornament in his life and would have hated anything grander. Ayana knelt beside it and cleared away the season's fallen leaves, the same small task she'd performed a dozen times before, except this time she found herself talking out loud to the stone, quiet, for the way she hadn't done since he'd first died. You should see what your letter started, she said. A trust with your name on it, 6 families with their land back, a rancher who reads your handwriting, more than he reads his own ledgers, I'd wager. She traced the edge of the stone with one finger. I wish you'd told me, about all of it, but I understand better now why you didn't. Some things a person carries because carrying them quietly is its own kind of gift to everyone around them. The wind moved through the grass, ordinary and unhurried, the same wind that had carried her out on that first desperate morning weeks before. Courage isn't the absence of fear, she said, half to the stone and half to herself. It's deciding to open the door anyway. I opened it, Grandpa. I hope it was the door you meant. She sat with him a while longer as the light went gold and then grey behind the hills, and rode back to the ranch in full dark, unafraid of the road for the first time in longer than she could remember. The fund took shape slower and with more care. Wade called it, first, simply the Land Recovery Office, plain name for a plain purpose, verifying old grants, correcting fraudulent surveys, for making sure no family in that territory lost ground to a stake driven in bad faith ever again. Elena, recovering steadily now, colour back in her cheeks, who suggested the name it finally carried. Call it after him, she said one evening. 3 of them gathered in Wade's study, papers spread across the desk between them. 4. Not because he'd have wanted the fuss. He wouldn't have. But because somebody ought to say his name out loud in this territory in a way that isn't a secret anymore. I like it, Wade said slowly. Fro, I'll admit it feels strange, putting a man's name on something this size when he never once wanted credit for anything in his life. That's exactly why it should carry his name, Elena said. The men who chase credit don't need a building to remind the world they existed. It's the ones who never asked for it who are most at risk of being forgotten, so it became the Taji Land Trust. Brina took the ledgers, steady hand and sharper eye for a discrepancy proving, for within the first month, to be worth considerably more than any clerk Wade could have hired off the street. She caught 2 more small irregularities in the ranch's own accounts entirely unrelated to Pratt, for oversights from years back that Wade had never once noticed. 4. And by the 2nd month he'd stopped pretending the position was a courtesy extended to a recovering woman, and started treating it, plainly and without apology, the skilled work it actually was. 4. Ayana became its voice riding out to families who'd been too frightened or too proud to come forward on their own, sitting with them the way Wade had once sat with her, listening before asking anything at all. She found over those weeks that the work suited her in a way she hadn't expected. For every ride out to some distant claim reminded her, from small way, of that first desperate morning, except now she was the one arriving with help instead of the one hoping to receive it, France, and there was a particular, quiet satisfaction in that reversal she hadn't known to look for beforehand. An unexpected friendship had taken root too, for between the ranch's 2 sharpest-tongued women, 4. Eleanor and Halloran, finding themselves thrown together daily over ledgers and household accounts until the working relationship had softened, degrees, something warmer, for Ayana came upon them, once in the kitchen. Heads bent together over a column of figures, Halloran laughing at something Elena had said with a freedom Ayana had never once witnessed in the woman during that first cold morning in the front hall. Your mother, Halloran told her later, has the driest wit of anyone I've met since my own husband passed. I'd forgotten how much I missed being properly teased by somebody who meant it kindly. She has that effect on people, eventually, Ayana said. It took me 22 years to stop being surprised by it. Halloran stayed on at the ranch. Something in her had shifted permanently that week, for Ayana thought, for watching her move through the house with a gentleness she hadn't carried before, not soft. Exactly, Halloran would never be soft, but open in a way that 11 years of grief had kept locked tight until a girl on a porch had refused to back down from it. Ayana, Halloran said one morning, setting a cup of coffee down at her elbow without being asked, for the honorific arriving as naturally as if she'd used it all along. Family out past the ridge, asking after the trust. Woman and her 2 sons. Same trouble as yours, near as I can tell. I'll ride out this afternoon. I'll have Copper saddled. Halloran hesitated. Just a moment, something working behind her eyes that hadn't quite found words yet. For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't leave that first morning. Or when I told you to, I'm glad I didn't either. Copper, for her part, had taken to ranch life with the placid indifference of a horse who had spent too many hard years on too little grain to be much impressed by comfort, now that she'd grown fat and glossy on the Callaway feed within a month. France, and one of the younger hands had taken to slipping her apple cores whenever he thought nobody was watching, for a habit Ayana had noticed early on and never once mentioned aloud, since it seemed unkind to spoil a kindness by naming it. Horse has done more 4-hour rides this year than most men manage in 5, Wade had remarked once, watching Copper doze in the afternoon sun outside the barn. I'd say she's earned her retirement if she'll allow it. She won't, Ayana had told him. She'd sooner go lame arguing about it than admit she's slowing down. Some creatures are built stubborn straight through, horse or otherwise. For Wade had laughed at that, and Ayana had privately suspected he wasn't only thinking of the horse. Halloran nodded once, and went back to her ledgers, and Ayana watched her go and thought about how strange a thing forgiveness was, how it didn't arrive all at once, like a door swinging open, slow, one small kindness at a time, 4. Until one day you looked up and realized the wall had come down somewhere along the way without anyone quite marking the moment it happened. Even mayors came by, ran weeks into it, bat in hand, standing awkward in the yard until Ayana came out to meet him. He didn't apologize outright. She hadn't expected him to. 4. And wouldn't have entirely trusted it if he had, but he asked. 4. Plain and a little embarrassed. 4. Whether the trust had use for a man who knew the eastern boundary lines better than most. 4. On account of running cattle along them for 15 years. I've been turning it over since that morning at the gate, he admitted, twisting his hat brim in both hands. Wasn't proud of how I acted. Told myself it was caution, same as I told the others. Caution doesn't usually come with a rifle already halfway to my shoulder before I've asked a single, honest question, though. It took me a while to admit that to myself. It takes most people longer than a while, Ayana said. I won't hold the delay against you, so long as what comes after is honest. Ayana said the trust did have use for him. 4. He came back the following week with a wagon load of supplies for the Ortiz family unasked, and never once mentioned the morning he'd stood at the gate with a rifle across his arm. Fran over the following months, for he became one of the trust's most reliable hands for verifying old boundary claims, for his years of riding those particular eastern lines proving more valuable than any surveyor's fresh measurements. 4. And Ayana found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, having to trust his word on a fence line as readily as she trusted anyone else's. From debts Ayana was learning, got paid in ways nobody announced out loud. That seemed more and more to be how the honest ones usually went. First snow came early that year, for dusting the mountains white, a full month ahead of what the old-timers called normal. And Ayana found herself, for one cold morning, standing in the ranch's well-stocked pantry, helping Halloran take inventory for the season ahead, sacks of flour stacked deep, salted meat enough to last well past spring, for nothing counted with worry, for only with the plain, for unremarkable thoroughness of people who had no particular reason to fear the number they'd land on. He thought, unbidden, of the study conversation from months before. What is it you want? Wade had asked her. Once this is settled one way or another. Grand, that's ours free and clear, she'd told him. A winter where I don't have to do arithmetic every time I eat something. She did the sum now without meaning to. The old habit not quite broken, even though the fear behind it finally had been and found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, for that the number came out easy, for unworried, for more than enough left over besides. Struck her, standing there with a sack of flour in her arms, strange thing to feel proud of, being unafraid of a pantry count. But she let herself feel it anyway, because she'd earned the right to, same as anyone who'd ever gone hungry and come out the other side of it whole. You've gone quiet, Halloran observed, marking a tally in her book. Just thinking how strange it is, Ayana said, to stand somewhere and not be doing arithmetic against dread. Halloran considered that a moment, and something soft crossed her weathered face. That's not a strange thing to notice, Miss Ayana, she said. That's the whole point of everything we've built this year, if you ask me. I hope you never stop noticing it. 4. The moment a person stops noticing a mercy like that is usually the moment they've forgotten what it costs to earn. 4. On a clear afternoon in late autumn, the whole territory gathered at the Callaway Ranch for something Wade insisted on calling a small remembrance. 4. Though by the time wagons had finished arriving, it looked like nothing small at all, for the yard had been swept and decorated with a restraint that suited the occasion, no garish bunting, no forced festivity, just long tables set out under the cottonwoods, and enough chairs borrowed from half the county to seat everyone who'd made the journey. Wood smoke drifted from cook fires, where 3 separate families had insisted on contributing something to the meal, unwilling to let the day pass as anything less than a shared effort. Families from 6 recovered claims. Folk who'd once looked at Ayana the way Myers had looked at her that first morning, and now stood in the same yard without a rifle in sight. Brashford returned for the occasion, standing near the back, with his bowler hat respectfully in hand, for having become, somewhat to Ayana's surprise, for a regular visitor to the ranch in the months since, drawn as much by genuine interest in the trust's work as by whatever business still remained between him and Wade. Arman, who'd become something like a fixture at the ranch in the months since, checking on Elena's lungs each week long after any doctor strictly needed to. Fact Elena pretended not to notice, and Ayana pretended not to find amusing. She'd caught them once, in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, sitting together on the porch, well past the point any medical examination could reasonably require. Harmon's black bag closed and forgotten at his feet, while the two of them traded stories about hard winters survived, laughing in a way that made Elena look, for a moment, 10 years younger than the fever had left her. For Ayana had said nothing about it to either of them, smiled to herself and gone quietly back inside, thinking that some debts of the heart didn't need any collecting at all, for only the patience to let them arrive in their own good time. Fine doctor, for Eleanor had said once, for catching Ayana's knowing look and refusing, with great dignity, to acknowledge it as anything more than professional observation. For he is, Ayana had agreed, equally solemn. Very thorough. Comes by awfully often to be thorough about one recovered patient, though. Elena had swatted her arm and changed the subject and Ayana had let her, because some things were sweeter left to unfold at their own pace than pushed along by a daughter's teasing. Of old soldiers, grey-haired now, who'd served in the fighting years back and come, for at Wade's personal invitation, stand witness to something that mattered more than any battle they remembered fighting. For Consuelo Ortiz had come with a basket of the same preserves she'd once pressed into Ayana's hands, insisting on sharing them with anyone who passed near her table. For Amos Carter stood near the fence in quiet conversation with two of the old soldiers, 3 of them trading stories in the easy, unhurried way of men who'd found, expectedly, that they had more in common than the colour of their coats had ever suggested. The Delgado boy tore through the yard with a pack of other children, entirely unconcerned with the solemnity the adults around him were attempting to maintain, struck Ayana, watching him, as exactly the right note for a day meant to celebrate a future rather than merely mourn a past. For Wade stood on the porch steps, the same steps Ayana had stood on the day she faced down an armed crowd, and this time the crowd had come to listen instead of accuse. For Ayana found Myers among the gathered families, standing near the back beside Amos Carter, 2 of them deep in easy conversation, and thought of how impossible that same sight would have seemed 4 months earlier. The man who'd once stood at this very gate, with a rifle across his arm, now trading stories with a man he likely wouldn't have shared a fence line with the previous spring. It wasn't a perfect transformation, she knew. Old fears didn't vanish entirely just because a debt got settled and a fraud got exposed. But it was a real one, and real transformations, she was learning, rarely arrived perfect. They arrived slow and partial and worth celebrating anyway for exactly what they were. He didn't tell the whole story again. Reed decided against it, told Ayana quietly beforehand, because some things were better honoured than repeated, and he didn't want the day to feel like a performance of grief rather than a genuine accounting of it. Most of you know some part of why we're standing here today, he said instead, his voice carrying clear across the yard. A debt I owed a man for 21 years, and spent 18 of them too comfortable to properly go looking for. I won't tell the whole of it again. Those who've heard it already know it costs me something each time, and those who haven't will hear enough of it today to understand the shape of what happened without me making a show of the details. He paused, looked out at the crowd, families whose land now stood secure. Raina, seated near the front with colour in her face and steel in her spine, Ayana beside her. What I've learned this year isn't only about one debt, though. It's that this territory is full of debts like it, quiet ones, unspoken ones, the kind that get carried by people who never once expected to be paid back, and would be embarrassed if you tried too loudly. Families stood to lose ground, to a man who counted on all of us being too tired, too poor, or too easily dismissed to notice what he was taking. He was wrong about every one of you standing here today, and I intend that he stay wrong for as long as this trust has breath left in it. A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the crowd, few heads nodding, brought Carter's voice carrying a low, firm, that's right from somewhere near the fence. What I will say is this. His granddaughter rode 4 hours through hard country to save a job that might have kept her family's roof standing one more winter. She didn't know, riding out that morning, that she was about to hand an old debt away home. Fresh did. And I intend to spend whatever years I've got left making sure that debt gets paid forward to every family in this territory who's ever been told their claim on this land, or their claim on being treated with basic decency, was worth less than somebody else's. For he lifted a hand toward the newly painted sign standing near the gate, the Taji Land Trust. For the letters had been carved deep into good oak by one of the ranch hands who'd once trained as a carpenter back east. The wood, stained dark and sealed against weather, meant to stand as long as the fence posts around it. Below the name, in smaller script, single line, Elena had insisted on adding once the sign was commissioned, for a debt owed in honor does not expire. Brianna had watched her mother oversee every detail of its carving with the same fierce, exacting care she brought to the ledgers, determined that if her father's name was going to stand in wood and paint for the whole territory to see, it would be done exactly right. Let that name mean something, Wade said. Let it mean that a debt owed in honor doesn't expire, not in 21 years, not in 100. And let it mean that in this territory from this day forward, nobody gets to decide what a person is worth before they've bothered to ask what that person has already given. The crowd was quiet a long moment. France, somewhere near the back, one of the old soldiers began to clap, slow and steady, and it spread through the gathered families like something catching until the whole yard was full of a sound. Ayana had never once expected to hear directed anywhere near her name. France, that evening, for once the wagons had rolled out and the yard had gone quiet again. For Ayana walked out past the fence line alone, the way she used to walk the land around the cabin, when she needed to think without anyone watching her think. Sky had gone the deep, bruised purple of early evening, stars just beginning to prick through above the mountains. And she stood there a while, letting the cold settle into her the way it always had, familiar now instead of frightening. 4 months. It had been only 4 months since she'd ridden out that first cold morning with nothing but a satchel and a lie about checking traps. And the distance between that girl and the woman standing at this fence now felt, some days, longer than the 4 hours it had taken to cross it. She thought of Elena, steady and sharp behind the trust's ledgers, now instead of laid up burning with fever. She thought of Halloran, who called her Miss Ayana, without a flicker of the coldness that had once coloured every word. She thought of Rosa Delgado, 10 years old, and already learning to notice things before she had words for them, the same way Ayana once had. Nothing about the shape of her life resembled the shape it had held that first morning. And yet, standing here, she felt more entirely herself than she ever had inside the old cabin's walls, as though the last 4 months hadn't changed who she was so much as finally given the rest of the world room enough to see it. She thought about the satchel, the photograph she'd almost left behind. She thought about her grandfather, sitting on a porch that no longer stood empty and cold, working leather with a knife, and telling her, without ever quite saying it plain, that courage was never about the absence of fear. Deciding to open the door anyway, she had opened it, not knowing that first cold morning what waited on the other side. Not knowing that a job interview would become a debt repaid, family saved, fraud uncovered, for a whole territory's worth of quiet theft dragged into daylight because one woman refused to be turned away from a front hall. Behind her, footsteps in the dirt. Wade came to stand beside her at the fence, quiet for a moment, looking out at the same darkening hills. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," he said finally. I didn't know him near long enough to say that with much authority, but I knew him 3 days once when it mattered most, and I think I know enough. He'd probably just say I should have packed more food for the ride. Wade laughed a real laugh, low and surprised out of him, the first one Ayana had heard since she'd arrived at his gate, a stranger with nothing but a satchel and her mother's name to offer. "That sounds about right," he said. "I left a letter, for Ayana said after the laugh had settled. Ren with the land grant, told whoever came looking that the debt was forgiven before it was ever collected, that a man who lives has the chance to do right by somebody else someday, and that was payment enough for him. I read it. I've read it a dozen times since. Does it help? 4. Knowing he forgave it before you even knew there was anything to forgive. Wade considered the question a long while, the kind of long while that told Ayanna he meant to answer it honestly rather than easily. Helps some, he said finally. It doesn't erase the 18 years. I don't think it was meant to. I think a man like that understood the difference between forgiving a debt and excusing a man from the work of paying it anyway. He let me off the hook for owing him personally. He never once said anything about letting me off the hook for what I did with the rest of my life once I understood what I owed. What will you do with the rest of it? The years you've got left? Keep building this, for one. Gestured small, toward the lamplit windows behind them, toward everything the trust had already become in a few short months. Find the families we haven't found yet. There are more out there, I'd wager. Pat's not the only man in this territory who's ever decided somebody else's claim mattered less than his own convenience. He glanced at her, something more careful in his expression now. 4. And I'd like your help doing it if you're willing to keep giving it. Not as a favour, as the same wage I offered your mother and the same say in how the work gets done. Ayanna turned that over, watching the last colour drain out of the sky above the mountains. I rode out here 4 days ago, thinking I was fighting for one job, she said. I didn't expect to end up running an office that didn't exist yet. Neither did I expect to spend $20,000 finding out my own front hall had been treating the wrong people like strangers. Wade's mouth curved wry. 4. Life has a way of handing a person considerably more than they rode out looking for, once they're willing to open the right door. That does sound like something he would have said. I've noticed I keep quoting a man I only knew for 3 days. 4. I hope that doesn't strike you as strange. It doesn't, Ayanna said. I think it means he's still teaching people even now. That's about the finest thing I can imagine anyone leaving behind. 4. Then I hope, whatever years I've got left, I manage to leave something half as useful behind me. You've made a fair start already, Ayanna said. 6 families with their land back. A trust with his name on it that'll likely outlast either one of us. 4. That's not a small thing to have built in 4 months, whatever comes after. Wade looked out at the dark shape of the mountains a long moment, something settling in his face that looked, to Ayanna, like a man finally at peace with a reckoning he'd spent 21 years avoiding. Your grandfather wrote that a man who lives has the chance to do right by someone else someday, he said. I used to think kind of sentiment belonged on a gravestone, something comforting people said after the fact, once it no longer cost anything to agree with it. I don't think that anymore. I think he meant it as instruction, not comfort. Every single day a chance like that, if a person's paying attention. He'd have liked you, Ayanna said, surprising herself with how certain she felt saying it. I didn't expect to be able to say it with any confidence that first morning in your front hall. I can say it now. That means more to me than you likely intend it to. I intend it exactly as much as it sounds like I do. They stood there together a while longer, in the cold and the quiet, 2 people, bound now by something older than either of them, for a debt that had travelled 21 years to find its way home, and had finally, long last, been paid not in money, not in land alone, but in the plain, stubborn decision of people willing to see each other clearly, for act on what they saw. Somewhere behind them, ramp-light glowed warm in the windows of a house that had, in the space of a few short months, become something closer to a second home than either of them had expected. And somewhere further back than that, past the mountains, past the years, for a young soldier lay bleeding in a wash, and a man with every reason to walk away chose instead to carry him. That was paid. But the courage it had taken to pay it, that, Ayanna understood now, watching the last light fade behind the hills, was never really a debt at all. It was a gift. Passed hand to hand, across 21 years and 2 families, and a territory that had finally, slowly, begun to learn how to see itself clearly. And gifts like that, she thought, don't ever really run out. They just keep finding someone new to carry them forward.